Magic Peanut Press presents The Bestowed, Champion of the Condemned, a Paladin origin story by C. Ryan Crockett.
The Bestowed, Champion of the Condemned, a Paladin origin story. Chapter 1. Ethnar woke to the moans of the dying and despondent. Complete darkness surrounded where he lay, but despite his lack of sight, he still felt overwhelmed by the assault on his other senses. The scent of sweat and urine engulfed him, along with the smell of damp, musty wood. The thick, muggy air weighed so heavily on him he thought he might choke on it. He tensed, manacles encasing his wrists and ankles. The taut chains splayed his limbs in an immovable X and pressed the dark skin of his shirtless back into the board of the bunk beneath him. He pushed against the bonds and pain exploded from seemingly every part of his body. Nature above he hurt. Apart from the groans of nearby men, chains clinked and wood gave long mournful creaks. The roll of the hard board beneath him, followed by a sudden upward pitch, finally helped Ethnar place himself. They'd put him on a slave ship. He'd heard rumors of the Berut clan selling their captives of war to such ships, but the Watani? The Watani mostly served as allies to Ethnar's clan, the Nia Yalara. Or at least they had until Ethnar, nature curse him, ruined that relationship at the Festival of Five. Memories flashed through his mind, painful memories. Memories Ethnar did not want. Memories Ethnar would endure 1,000 slaver-ship voyages to unmake. His victory in the ring, blood-staining his trident, the Watani clan's secret attack, the powerful Kragmason, the fire. Lying helpless and broken in the village square, he pulled uselessly against the chains binding him. His first instinct was to plan some sort of escape, but that thought died almost immediately. Where could he go if he did escape? Despair enveloped him, and along with it screams from the not-so-distant past. A tinny clanging blessedly brought him from his memories, and a small dim light illuminated the hull around him. With great effort, Ethnar rolled his head to one side, taking in rows of bunks and a tiny square of light down the walkway. Within the walkway stood two thick silhouettes. The clanging continued. A ladle and a bucket, Ethnar suspected. "Time for your din-din. Mummy whipped up a real treat for you today," a man said in Valorian. Coarse laughter followed the announcement. Then the hull quieted and the two men worked their way down the walkway. Ethnar couldn't see what food they served or how, but he couldn't imagine it being very good. One of the two servers began singing a crass drinking song. Eventually, the men reached his row, which looked to be the end, the metal ladle scraping the bucket as they served the poor soul beneath him. The singing suddenly stopped, and a man's ruddy face came into view, only a hand's width away from Ethnar's. "Well, confound it, Rin," Mr. Hero went and woke up. A tiny bit of spittle landed on Ethnar's face. Laughter, even more brittle than before, burst from the second server. The laughter stopped when the first man conked him on the head with his ladle. A second later, a slop of gruel landed on Ethnar's lips. He tried to roll every glop of it into his mouth, but inevitably, some slid down his cheek and onto the board beneath him. In all honesty, it was better than he expected. Boiled soapy grain, not even stale. His Mamuna had given him worse for evening meal when he disobeyed as a child. The casual thought of his Mamuna instantly made him queasy, and he vomited up the little bit of soapy. Nature above the closest server cursed, "You about soiled my favorite boots. Now don't think you're getting any seconds on account of this. Now open up." A second later, another ladle touched his lips, this one holding water. Thankfully, the man waited a second before pouring, giving Ethnar time to open his mouth. He coughed, the water difficult to swallow while lying down. His throat felt raw and swollen, reminding him of the bestial cries he'd made when last awake. Finished, the two men turned and headed up the walkway. After a minute, the door closed, returning Ethnar to darkness. "They bet on if you would wake up. That's why he's so mad," a youthful voice from beneath him said in choppy Valorian. The use of Valorian surprised Ethnar for a moment, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. His native language, Hota, had so many dialects that speaking Valorian very well could be an easier way to communicate. Still, not many northern clansmen could speak Valorian. Odds were that Ethnar and this youth were the only two clansmen on the ship who did, but how had the youth known that? Language aside, Ethnar felt a bitter satisfaction at the server's lost bet. It certainly wasn't the first time people had lost coin betting against him. It probably means worse treatment for me now, Ethnar said into the darkness. Things can't really get worse from here, I think, the voice responded. Ethnar wanted to push back against that idea, but he couldn't. Their captors could torture them in a plethora of different ways, and there was always death. But those sounded much better than being left alone with his thoughts, being left alone with the screams. He was full to bet against the warrior leader of the Nagyalara clan, champion of the Festival of Five. So the youth knew who Ethnar was. And who are you, he asked. I am Tassak, third prince of the Fadan. Pride laced the young man's voice. At least he still had that. Ethnar's stomach sank. That didn't make sense. How had Tassak, a prince of the Fadan clan, ended up on a boat bound for servitude? Fadan territory was at least a week's journey from Ethnar's home, and even further from a port that could house a boat of this size. He tilted his head to direct his voice a little more in Tassak's direction. Is every slave on this boat of the Fadan clan? They can only make us slaves if we see ourselves that way, Tassak said. Ethnar snorted. They were tied to bunks and would soon perform labor for exacting masters. Unless some miracle released them, they were slaves, no matter what Tassak wanted to believe. Do you know the answer to my question or not? Ethnar asked. Tassak sighed. Most of us are of the Fadan clan, though they have a few Watani criminals tied up at the front. Where were Ethnar's clansmen? He had fought alongside them until the Krag Mason attacked, immobilizing them all. They had all toppled over like newly felled saplings. Why had they separated him from them? We are sure to win our freedom now with you awake, Tassak said, his voice an excited whisper. If I defy our captors with you by my side, all the sons of Fadan will follow. Ethnar set his jaw, so Tassak wanted a hero, more like a martyr. Given Tassak's perception of him, the reason why his captors had separated him from his clan became clear: to leave them without a leader. Probably a good strategy in general, but unnecessary in this case. Go to sleep, young one, Ethnar said, wishing he could roll over. I will lead no revolt. I have counted their crew when they take us to stretch. They have but 7 men. There are 60 of us down here, Tassak said earnestly. Ethnar shook his head, though he knew Tassak couldn't see it. In combat, 1 free man is greater than 100 men who are bound. What is 1 lion, no matter how great, Tassak said, in the face of stampeding wildebeest? Nice proverb, Ethnar said, except for the wildebeest out in front. How many wildebeest are you willing to sacrifice to reach your goals? And who are you to make that choice for them? Tassak remained quiet, probably pondering Ethnar's question, as he should. These were not decisions to take lightly. Ethnar had lost too many wildebeest, his entire herd. His muscles tightened, and he tensed against his bonds as the screams began again in his mind. The same 2 Valorians came several hours later and unlocked the chains of the men around Ethnar. They returned and unlocked Tassak beneath him. Unlike the others, they bound Tassak's hands. Rough hands reached over Ethnar, keys jangling. The man unlocked his legs and 1 arm, but had to extend over Ethnar to reach his other hand. His breath smelled of cheap wine and old fish. Ethnar resisted the temptation to jab the man in the gut and take the keys. It would be so easy, but then what? The man pulled him from the bunk and Ethnar fell to the floor, his body collapsing, muscles locked up from inactivity. Up you come, Nagyalaran, the man above him said. Ethnar tried to stand, but his muscles cramped as he did so, and he fell back to the floor. Some of them, Watani said you might give us trouble, the other men said. Said you was some special case, dangerous. He kicked Ethnar in the side. Pain shot through him and he curled up into a ball on the floor. From above the men laughed. Ethnar coughed and then cleared his throat. They were wrong. For a moment the men stopped, surprised that he'd spoken at all, but then they laughed all the more. Tassak looked on, his face horrified, like a pack of hyenas had eaten his limb. The young man had a broad build strong through the shoulders. Ethnar could remember meeting the Fadan clan leader at the festival, a mountain of a man. His son certainly took after him. No wonder the boy felt invincible. He had a lot of layers to go through before the slavers could beat it out of him. The slaver pulled Ethnar up and wrapped a rope around his wrists. Not that I be questioning the integrity of what he just said, but orders is orders. He pulled the rope taut and shoved Ethnar toward the door. Passing by the rows of men in bunks made Ethnar want to vomit, and not because of the smell. Who could do this to another human being? But beliefs ran deep. The 5 clans had started the Festival of 5 just for that reason. It helped the clans associate, see others as human, even though they live differently. Naive dreams. He stepped out onto the deck, blinding light forcing his eyes closed. Try as he might, he couldn't get them open. Someone moved him to where they wanted him. "March," a voice shouted, and Ethnar blinked furiously, finally squinting in the bright light of day. 8 slaves marched in place on the deck of a Valorian-made vessel. The size and scale of the craft dwarfing the fishing boats Ethnar's father had made for their village. A reed whipped the back of Ethnar's thighs, the sting forcing his eyes back shut. "March," the voice repeated. Ethnar complied, lifting his knees alternately. At first he could barely get a foot off the ground, but as the exercise continued, he could feel his muscles loosen. He rolled his shoulders and bounced back and forth on the balls of his feet, like he did before a bout. His left shoulder still hung awkwardly from the fight when they'd captured him. And he could tell now that he had some bandaging on his head where they'd struck him. Not the worst shape he'd ever been in, physically at least. If he could just focus on the physical pain, maybe the screams wouldn't have enough space in his mind. Some urgent shouting forced his eyes open. The 2 men who fed them struggled with an irate tussock. A few feet away, another Valorian pointed a crossbow at the wrestling group. He held the weapon clumsily, and his face showed fear more than anything. Ethnar took a step closer, and the reed struck him again, this time on his bare back. "Don't you get involved," the man behind him said. Tarsak shouldered one man away, then the other. Only then did Ethnar see what the boy held in his hands. A deck mop. Nothing more than a sturdy wooden stick with strips of cloth tied to the end. Tarsak looked Ethnar right in the eyes and tossed the mop. "Champion, show these sons of Fadan that we have no reason to cower in fear." The mop hit the deck in front of Ethnar, clattering until it stopped at his feet. He could picture it all in his head. He'd duck and grab the mop before sweeping it around and catching the man with the reed behind the knees, dropping him. The bowman would fire off an unsteady shot, missing. Ethnar could now see that they had a second bowman on a higher deck, but he could evade that arrow by using the man with the reed as cover until he made it behind the mast. The other crewmen would have made it to him by that time, and most of them had swords. He didn't know how many hits the mop could take, but he could probably fight through them quickly enough without having to use it to block, and then he'd... A blond man stepped out of the crew quarters at the front of the ship. He wore a silk shirt, unfit for seafaring, and around his neck hung a gold chain. At the end of the chain, centered on his chest, hung a large black pearl, the keystone that unlocked his Krug Mason powers. This was the Krug Mason who had defeated Ethnar. While Ethnar had faced many Krug Masons in the ring, he'd never seen someone with powers like this. This was the man who had almost single-handedly captured all the men of Ethnar's clan. The man who rounded up the women and children of Ethnar's village and threw them into one hut, and then set that hut aflame. Ethnar collapsed onto his knees and cradled his head, the screams of his Mamuna and sister refusing to leave him. The screams of Belana, his betrothed, echoing across the ship. The mop appeared to be a trident in front of him. His trident, covered in the blood of the Watani champion. It was the final fight. The Watani second prince had pressed too hard, too aggressively. Ethnar had moved to the side, planting his trident in the sand and impaling the second prince through the neck. Death rarely happened during the fights at the festival. They fought until submission or incapacitation. The Tumus clan had a luminant who would heal champions after each fight, preparing them for their rounds the next day. She ran out onto the field, hands glowing with the sun's healing power, but it was too late. The Watani clan left the festival early, their clan leader vowing revenge for his son. The next time Ethnar saw him was with the light of the flames that burned his family, The clan leader clenched his teeth, eyes ablaze as he clubbed Ethnar over the head. Then Ethnar woke up tied to a bunk on this ship. Tassak pulled Ethnar from his thoughts with a yell. The Fadan prince charged the Crag Mason, arms raised. The black pearl on the Crag Mason's chest flashed once, and Tassak, along with every other slave on deck, collapsed. Even expecting it, Ethnar gasped as the strength left his body. He'd already fallen to his knees, but he dropped onto all fours to support himself, the muscles in his arms barely keeping him from face-planting on the deck. The Crag Mason's ability sucked strength from those around him that he chose. The first time Ethnar had encountered it, it had taken his determination just to stand. Tassak fought a similar battle now, and made it to his knees before the Crag Mason approached and backhanded him across the cheek. People don't realize how much they absorb when they receive a normal blow. With no strength left in him, the massive Tassak flailed backward at the strike, hitting the deck like a rag doll. The Crag Mason shook his head chidingly at Tassak, and then looked up at the other slaves. Your job, when we so graciously allow you on deck, is to march. He scanned their eyes for defiance, ending with Ethnar. His dark eyes bore into Ethnar's. Now march. The oppressive weight of frailty lifted, and all the slaves took in relieved breaths. Ethnar grabbed the mop and handed it to the crew member behind him, free hand clenching as he did so. Tassak shot him a look of utter betrayal, blood trickling from a cut on his head. Ethnar kept his head down, refusing to meet Tassak's gaze. He lifted his knees back and forth in a steady rhythm, marching along with the rest of the slaves. Chapter 2. They let the slaves out in groups once every day to march, as Tassak didn't speak to Ethnar for 3 days, though when he finally did speak, it felt like no time had passed since his fight with their handlers. Why did you not fight? Tassak asked. The question sounded innocent, incredulous, rather than an accusation. Ethnar sighed. He had expected the question earlier, but had thought he'd escaped having to answer it. Do you think I could have done something against that Crag Mason? Ethnar asked, his voice hoarse from days without talking and minimal water. So that's why you didn't fight? Fear of losing? Ethnar bit his lip. Fear might be the whole of it, but not of losing. More of fear of what came after losing. Young one, everyone I have ever fought for is dead. He didn't know if nature wanted to punish him specifically, or if fighting in general brought on such consequences. What he did know was that he never wanted to fight again. He knew himself, though, knew he'd feel the urge to protect at some point. But he'd resist. His protection equated to nothing but death. He hadn't been enough. Thankfully, Tassak gave no replies. The 2 handlers came a few minutes later, time for exercises. They unlocked Tassak, their postures wary. A bruise was still visible on the bigger, longer-haired one's cheek from when Tassak knocked him over. Ethnar had since learned his name was Gad. He hadn't sung any drinking songs since then. Rin, the other handler, wrapped a rope around Tassak's wrists. You do anything this time and I don't care what you're worth, he hissed. He'd lost several teeth over the years and his jaw hung offset, so he spat with every word he spoke. Tassak kept his shoulders back and said nothing. Ethnar could already see the boy had thinned some. A shout from on deck, followed by a clanging bell, brought God's and Rin's heads around. Ethnar didn't know what the bell meant, but it must have held some importance because both God and Rin stopped whatever they were doing and ran down the walkway. Rin gave a shout back to Tassak. You stay below deck or the boss will kill you. They closed the door behind them and a heavy crossbar thudded into place. In the darkness, Ethnar heard the jangle of keys. Nature be praised, Tassak said, as he brought the keys over to Ethnar's manacles. You be careful, Tassak, Ethnar said. You have pushed their patience already. Tassak fumbled to find the keyhole in the dark, but eventually the first manacle on Ethnar's hand clicked open. I would rather die than live my life in bondage. What is my life worth if it is not mine? Ethnar rotated his wrist, enjoying the movement. You might be surprised. Tassak moved the keys to Ethnar's other hand. Please don't, Tassak, Ethnar said. I want no part of this. It will only cause harm. Tassak continued as if he hadn't heard. Ethnar tried to stop Tassak with his one hand, but nature take him, the boy was strong. Once Tassak unlocked the other hand, Ethnar didn't even try to stop him from unlocking his legs. As the last manacle clicked free, Tassak spoke. I have freed you this far, you must choose what you do next. The mini-lecture felt a tad condescending, but he wasn't wrong. If Ethnar stayed in his bunk, he probably wouldn't face too harsh of repercussions, just like he'd faced no consequences for handing back the mop. But I want you to know, Tassak continued, you fought for me in that final match at the Festival of 5-2. You defeated my best friend in the match before. In our loss, we became your following in a way. Better to lose to champion than runner-up. Not everyone you have fought for is gone. Then Tassak left speaking to someone a ways down. Confound him, he was going to get himself and a lot of others killed. For all they knew, the bell meant that Gad and Rin had forgotten to get the Crag Mason his lunch, and they'd lose an ear or something if they didn't get it to him soon. Of course, that explanation didn't explain the crew scuffling across the deck above him, footsteps short and hurried. More likely, they'd spotted a threat. But who would attack a slaver ship? None of the Northern Clan's vessels could handle the open sea like this one. And who else cared enough to make the effort? Another slaver ship, perhaps, but even that didn't add up. A bang resounded through the hull as someone rammed into the door at the end of the walkway. Tassak, no doubt. Did he have a single drop of self-preservation in him? Nature bless his Mamuna for getting him to adulthood in one piece. Another bang sounded, and Ethnar groaned before sliding his legs over the side of his bunk and slowly lowering himself down. His muscles complained with every movement. His body still hadn't recovered from the fight in his village, and given the living conditions, he had only gotten worse. He didn't want to get involved, but at least it wasn't a fight. Not yet, at least. He didn't think Tassak would hit him for interfering. Shouts from above caused Ethnar to flinch, and he contemplated scurrying back to his bunk. He let out a breath and lowered his head. A few days of abuse, and they already had him acting like a beaten dog. Tassak may be a fool, but he had a point. Ethnar limped to where Tassak had freed another man. The clanking of keys and whispering in Hauta revealed that Tassak had passed the keys to another one of the slaves. Ethnar hurried down the walkway and ran into Tassak, scooting back for another run at the door. Ethnar fell to the deck. Tassak didn't budge. Tassak, think about what you're doing, Ethnar whispered. Do you really believe you're just going to bust through that crossbar and free everyone? We're at sea. Where would you go? They're following the coastline. I've been able to spot it each time they take us out, Tassak said, breathing heavily. Ethnar almost laughed. Yeah, several miles away. How many of your people swim? Tassak gave no reply, not that Ethnar thought he would. Of all the clans, the Fadan lived furthest from the ocean. The only way to safety is on this boat. Tassak didn't hesitate. Then we take over boat. Ethnar wanted to tear the youth's hair out. You and who else? What are you going to do to stop the Crag Mason? We have to try. Ethnar shook his head. No, you don't. Not now, at least. Wait for a better time. When is a better time than when your captors leave you with their keys? Ethnar let out an exasperated huff. A time when you can at least see what's going on and make an informed decision. A time without an incredibly powerful Crag Mason. A man to their side yelled out Tassak's name. Ethnar turned his direction, but of course saw nothing. There's a window on the other side of my bunk, the man said in Hauta. Ethnar looked over. A window? That direction looked just as dark as any other. Still, he reached over the man and found the hull of the ship. After a little fumbling around, his hand ran across a wooden knob with a metal latch. He flipped the latch up and pulled on the knob. With a little sucking sound, the knob came away, and Ethnar rocked back, light streaming into the space. In his hand he held a small square of wood, surrounded by some sort of flexible seal. He leaned forward, sticking his head out of the window. The freshness of the sea air brought a welcome relief from the rank prison they sailed in. In that moment, Ethnar wished he could jump into the sea, just as Tassak had suggested. Unlike the Fadan, the Nialaran clan lived along the coast, fishing their primary means of survival. Unfortunately, the window barely fit his head, let alone his shoulders. He also had no idea if even he could make the long swim to shore. As he turned his head to the left, he caught sight of a long, sleek vessel, 3 white sails and dozens of oars extending from the ship. The oars protruded from large cutouts in the hull. The ship approached quickly, almost close enough to exchange volleys. From atop the center mast flew the flag of the Mazina tribe, Tahirians. While the people of Tahir had separated into tribes, much like the clans of the north, the Sajas from each tribe met in council at least yearly to establish national law and resolve disputes. Tahirian tribes hadn't warred with one another in centuries, nor had they warred with clansmen. Their unity made them much too powerful for any northern clan to confront. Ethnar had often envied their stability and encouraged the traders from his village to do business with them. He frequently interacted with the Tahirian caravan guards when accompanying them as protection. All this made the ship approaching them a bit of a mystery. Tahirian pirates, if such a thing existed, would be punished severely for flying the Mazina flag. "Prepare for boarding," yelled a voice from the Tahirian ship. "Illegal wares and slaves are not permitted in Tahirian waters." So that was it. Tahirians did all they could to abolish slavery. Their efforts had borne fruit over the last century in the northern clans. But Valoria still boiled in a constant mess of socio-political turmoil, and slavery had flourished there, or so he'd heard. He'd never thought he'd find out for himself. "Gad, distribute the pyrotar among the men and prepare to launch on my signal," barked the dark crag mason on deck. Ethnar looked up but could see nothing but railing. He didn't know exactly what pyrotar was, but he could put enough together to know it wouldn't end well for the Tahirians. He could picture a burning boat full of men, incapacitated by the crag mason's gift. An instant pyre. Tussock tugged at Ethnar from behind. "What's happening? Have they come to save us?" Ethnar let Tussock pull him back into the darkness. "No," he said with a shake of his head. "That ship is headed to a slaughter." Chapter 3. Ethnar landed on the poor fellow still tied to his bunk as Tussock pushed past him to see out the tiny window. "We've got to warn them." Ethnar reached out and grabbed Tussock by the forearm. "Think for a second. If you warn them, what will happen to you? Who will lead your people? Do you think they'll find the moment to free themselves without your leadership?" Tussock paused, blinking furiously to adjust to the light from the window. "I still cannot stand by when I could have done something," he said after a moment. Ethnar threw up his hands. The youth had well learned the lessons of ethics, but had not as yet lived long enough to learn the ones about reality. The thought struck him as ironic that here he was still trying to protect Tussock, but by the act of not fighting and urging Tussock to do the same. Why did Ethnar even care anymore? Hadn't he lost enough people he cared about? On top of that, Tussock's question lingered. Could Ethnar stand by when he could have done something? Ethnar sighed. "Move aside, young one. Let me at least try something first." "You call me young one, champion," Tussock said, "yet you are not even 6 years my elder." Despite the defiance, the youth moved off the bunk so Ethnar could return to the window. Ethnar nodded in gratitude to Tussock. 6 years is enough. He curled his hands around his mouth and let a coo out the window, like that of a dove or sea pigeon. He did it twice, and then a third time, hoping the noise didn't attract the attention of the crew above, while praying to nature that someone on the Tahirian ship might notice. If the Tahirians had a boarding party, they must have soldiers. And if they had soldiers, they may have recruited some of them from caravan guardsmen. It was a long shot. Ethnar didn't expect to have met any of the ones on board, but they would know the code, and that would be enough. After his third coup, Ethnar stuck his arm as far out the window as possible, tucking in his pointer and middle fingers with his thumb, but leaving his last 2 fingers extended. He waved vigorously, as much as the window allowed, and then made the gesture with his fingers again. He repeated the pattern 4 times before pulling his arm back in and sticking his head out. The Tahirian ship grew close, though still not quite close enough for boarding. So no one saw him. Or no one understood if they had. "Ready," the Craig Mason's voice called from above. The Tahirian ship pitched, halting its forward progression and turning sharply to the left and away from the slave ship. One side of the oarsmen had paddled backwards. The slave ship's forward course took it away from the Tahirian vessel. Ethnar's shoulders relaxed, and he let out a breath of relief. He'd known there had to have been at least one caravansman on that boat. "They're turning around," he called back to Tassak. He felt a congratulatory pat on his shoulder. "Fire," the Krug Mason yelled, though his voice sounded more frantic than commanding. Flaming black spheres launched out from the slave ship, but they hit the water, short of the Tahirians. Yet even as they hit the water, flames spread out from them across the surface of the ocean. One flame splashed onto an oar and spread up it. Ethnar expected the flames to abate once the oar dipped back into the water, but if anything, the flames grew as they came back up out of the water. A shout came from the Tahirian ship as someone flung the oar completely off board. Above, the Craig Mason cursed, and Ethnar heard him stomp back to the rear of the ship. The back third of the oars in the Tahirian vessel dropped and dragged in the water as the Craig Mason's bestowal hit them. Blessedly, the remaining oars increased their pace without losing rhythm, and the Tahirian ship pulled away. As it did so, the oars further back joined in the pattern, their oarsmen out of range from the Craig Mason. Ethnar reflexively began to measure mentally the range of the Krog Mason's attack, but stopped. He wasn't going to get involved, wasn't going to fight. So why did knowing the range of the attack matter? "Do I bring the ship around, Captain?" a voice called from above. "No," the Krog Mason said, "but we've never let one get away before." The Krog Mason practically growled, "I know that. We needed someone to spread fear of our vessel anyway. This could be good for us. Even so, them retreating so abruptly is suspicious, like somebody warned them." There was a long pause before the Krag Mason spoke again. "Check the prisoners. That young Fardan prince could have something to do with this." Chapter 4. Ethnar jogged his head back into the ship, scraping his temple in the process. He groped around frantically for the window's seal before finding it and slamming it back into the hole. He slid the latch down in place, instantly missing the sunlight. "Tassak, return to your bunks and manacles. The Krag Mason is coming." The Krag Mason could essentially freeze them all in place, and who knows what he'd do to them. He obviously wanted a product to sell whenever they got to Valoria, but that didn't mean he couldn't make an example of a few. Like, a few who gotten out of their bonds. What had Tassak thought the freed slaves could do? "What was that signal you sent?" Tassak asked, ignoring his request. "How did they know to turn around?" Ethnar stood, wishing Tassak could see his look of disapproval. "An old mercenary code to call off a deal. We'd coo and then flash the signal to each other when a trader tried to swindle someone. Now please, for the love of all things natural, get your people to return to their bunks." Tassak barked out some orders in Horta, and nature, bless him, headed back down the walkway. Ethnar hurried after him, running as best as his weak body could. Behind him, he could hear someone lifting the crossbar. He reached the end of the row as the door opened. His captors probably couldn't see him that far down the row without their eyes having adjusted. He grabbed hold of his bunk and pulled up. His muscles gave out as an unseen power ripped away his strength. He collapsed onto the floor as a collective groan sounded from all the prisoners. He felt so weak. He almost didn't notice as a manacle from the bed next to him wrapped around his arm and clicked. The keys clanked down onto the floor at his side. He lay there pathetically, until a dark shape loomed over him. The shape bent down and lifted the keys with a huff of disdain. "Rin, do you think this is a game?" the Krog Mason said. A thump sounded as another body hit the floor. "Rin." The Krag Mason turned around. "We don't get do-overs. We make a mistake in keeping these Hutharans contained, and they will kill us." "I'm sorry," Rin said, voice weak. "I didn't realize her." "You didn't realize that leaving the keys could mean some escaped prisoners?" "Well, I think what you didn't realize is that if I kill a slave on this voyage, I lose a pretty penny. If I kill you on this voyage, there are plenty of workers at the Alfian docks willing to work your same wage." "And you," the Krag Mason said, turning back to Ethnar. He eyed the manacle holding Ethnar down. "You're lucky you're so slow and broken that you couldn't cause any more harm." The Krug mason looked to the lower bunk, Tussac chained with 3 of his manacles. Tussac kept his untethered arm up, as if it had a manacle on it. The darkness made it difficult to see that Ethnar wore his 4th manacle. Ethnar couldn't tell whether the Krug mason saw through the ruse and didn't care, or whether he simply didn't see it. But he turned back to the rest of the group without a word to Tussac. "A reminder to all of you," the Krug mason said, raising his voice. "I don't just captain this ship. I own it, and 12 others just like it. The city of Alpheus bows to me. You don't leave my influence once I sell you. I am your father because I gave this new life to you. You will bear my name forevermore, and you will be grateful for it." He strode up the walkway and out the single door, everyone relaxing as he relinquished his grip on them. Rin and Gad scurried to chain Ethnar up. God tilted his head to the side and pursed his lips, examining Ethnar's 1-manacled hand. Silently, he unlocked Ethnar from Tussac's manacle and helped him climb into his own bunk. Would Gad mention it to his boss? Would it matter? Rin and Gad made their way down the rows of bunks, meticulously checking each manacle. Gad finished sooner than Rin, who kept darting his left hand to the keys attached at his hip. Finally, they closed the hull door once again, plunging the slaves into darkness. "You saved that boat," Tussac said as soon as the door closed, his voice filled with incredulous hope. A young man chained to a board and headed for a life of servitude shouldn't sound like that. "Lucky someone on that boat understood my signal, that's all." No need for the youth to get his expectations of Ethnar up again. Lucky? Nature sent us the 1 man onto our boat who could warn those men, and from different clan. It was a little more than luck. Tussac paused for a moment before continuing. "I had almost given up on you, champion. I thought you had lost all courage, but patience and caution are also important aspects of a warrior, are they not? I will try to learn them from you." Ethnar's stomach tightened, too late about those expectations, and he didn't even want to try to process his feelings towards nature at the moment. He mulled over Tussac's words in his mind, bothered by the implications despite the word's intent as a compliment. "Tussac," Ethnar swallowed, unsure if he should continue. "What if I have lost all courage? Would that be so bad in a man who has lost everything else?" Ethnar felt exposed saying the words, grateful only he and Tussac spoke Valorian. "It would be bad for a champion," Tussac said readily. Ethnar shook his head. Of course Tussac thought that. Ethnar wanted to throw his hands up in frustration. Instead he just tensed against his bonds. Man is not immortal. Champions are fallible. We can each only carry so much water back from the well. Is it not excusable for a man to break when the weight is too much? Ethnar's heartbeat accelerated. The words had come freely, almost too freely. He listened to Tussac's controlled breathing, waiting for the youth's answer. "Man does break," Tussac said eventually, each word coming out slow and calculated. "This is why we have clans and villages, to distribute the weight. But I cannot live in a world of excuses. We expect goodness from ourselves and others because we refuse to stay stuck in the mud. If we do not strive, what do we hope for?" Tussac stopped and sucked in a breath as the boat tossed and pitched on a rougher patch of water. When it stilled, he gave a small moan. Was Tussac dealing with seasickness? Ethnar hadn't felt much, but he'd been on the ocean every day of his childhood. He could picture his father asking him to feel the lap of the waves against the wood, to notice how the shape of the boat cut through the water. He rubbed his thumb along the length of his pointer finger, appreciating the calluses still there, even though he hadn't carved a boat in years. The product of hours spent scraping layers of wood off a log, one shaving at a time. The rough water continued to rock them in their bunks, but Tussac spoke through his seasickness. "I do not wish a hopeless life on anyone, especially a man who has lost everything. If a heavy burden is all it takes to excuse our expectations of a person, it is a wonder anyone achieves anything at all. I choose to believe that even the most downtrodden can do what is right. Then, at the end of the day, they can pull their head up out of the mud and look to the sky as nature washes the mud from their face with sweet cleansing rain." Ethnar inhaled deeply. Tussac's imagery was beautiful. Perhaps third princes had time to pursue poetry. But every metaphor could be pushed. Wasn't it nature's rain that made the mud in the first place? Ethnar asked. True, Tassak said. Ethnar could hear the smile in his voice. But I still don't wish for anyone to set up their bed in it. Do you believe that nature's purpose for rain is just to make a mud pit for you to fall into? Point taken. Still, this wasn't the point Ethnar had the largest problem with, so he got to the heart of his issue. You expect too much of people. Tassak sighed. Perhaps, but I find it better than expecting too little. Ethnar didn't respond. Instead, he lay there listening to the lap of waves against the ship, though it wasn't loud enough to cover up the discomforted noises of the other slaves. You know, Ethnar said after a time, not to put a damper on your imagery, but a mud pit bed sounds pretty nice compared to my bed right now. Tassak chuckled. That it does, champion, that it does. Chapter 5. A bell clanged and boards thudded on the deck as they reached port. The last 4 days had passed much the same. The smells, which Ethnar had found putrid upon waking, had only gotten worse, as each slave languished in their own filth. The mood among the slaves intrigued Ethnar, a sense of nervousness that Ethnar normally associated with festivals and betrothals hung in the air. Not true excitement, really, just a sliver of hope. Their next day couldn't be worse than this, could it? At least they could get up and move. He even heard men discussing what they thought Alpheus must be like. It felt so naive, but what would Ethnar have them do? Live with no hope at all? Like him. Ged and Rin came and unlocked them. They led them off the ship to a fenced corral with a stone wall on one side. Water poured from a small aqueduct on the wall, and 2 large guards funneled slaves into the stream, commanding them, in terrible hauta, to wash. The slaves complied willingly. In fact, the Fadan looked just as happy to be on solid ground as they did to be washing. Ethnar stepped up when his turn came, the water stinging slightly as it crashed against his back. He looked down at his chest and shoulders, noticing already a weakening of the muscles he had worked so hard to master and build. He was less than he was just a fortnight ago. Tassak washed off after him, but then immediately following, 2 other men came with a hinged board with holes for hands and a head. They clamped the board around Tassak and pushed him into a corner. Tassak glared at them like a lion with his paws caught in his own mane. After shackling Tassak, the men found a different slave on the opposite end of the crowded corral. Ethnar couldn't see much, but the entire group had to shift because of a scuffle. He pressed his way between bodies to get a better view of the fight. The 2 guards now had hold of a thin Fadan man by his hands and feet. The man was in poor shape, pale and sick from the voyage. The 2 guards took the man and threw him over the side of the dock. Ethnar stood in shock, as did most of the clansmen. Tassak roared, but the guards had been expecting this. 4 of them, holding sturdy reeds, had surrounded Tassak and beat him back into the corner. Welts rose instantly on the young prince's arms and legs, while hits on his back drew blood. The sick man probably hadn't drowned yet. If Ethnar pushed through the crowd, he could easily fight his way past those 2 guards and... No, he wasn't that man anymore. Besides, atop the wall stood 2 men with crossbows. They'd track him as he pushed through the crowd and hit him as he struck out at the guards below. Unlike the crew member on the ship, these men held their weapons steady. The other concern was the dark crag mason. Ethnar couldn't see him, but he couldn't have gotten far, and these other guards could have powers as well. One of them wore a gemmed ring, and another had a necklace tucked into his shirt, both possible keystones for a crag mason's. Ethnar had no way of knowing unless they showed abilities. And what would Ethnar do with the sick man once he'd saved him? Nurse him to health? Nurse him with what? And where? Most likely they'd just beat him and throw them back in. So Ethnar just looked away, eyes fixed on the moss growing on the crumbling wall to his left. Your previous occupation? The man at the table asked in Hauta. He had the dark skin of a clansman, but he wore Valorian clothes and spectacles. Ethnar didn't know if he was a slave or freeman, but either way, his haughty manner toward the slaves made Ethnar dislike him. Protector, Ethnar said quietly, shoulders hunched, trying to push the screams away that nudged on the edge of his mind. No protector could say their title proudly with their hands bound, waiting in line to be processed and sold. The man looked up from his scroll and removed his spectacles. You don't talk like a Fadan. Ethnar held up his chin. I am a son of Nialara. The man rolled his eyes and shook his head. The Nialaran don't raise protectors. What simple trade did your father teach you before you were chosen as a protector? Ethnar clenched his fists. The man said it so matter-of-factly, so expectantly. His father had spent hours and hours, years passing on his simple trade. He'd made Ethnar run his hands along hundreds of different trees, just to choose the right one. Woodworking. Product, the man said, putting his glasses back on and picking up his pen. Boats, Ethnar said numbly, though I also made a lot of baskets. We used them for traps. He rubbed his thumbs across the calluses on his fingers. It felt like a lifetime ago, before being a protector, before winning, before losing. The man looked over the rim of his glasses at Ethnar, a mocking smile playing at his lips. Before you became a warrior, you wove baskets. Ethnar rolled his shoulders back. He actually had nothing left to be proud of, but he'd been proud once upon a time. His conical design for baskets had helped a lot of fishermen in his village double their annual catch. Both combat and baskets require patience, which will serve me well here, I think. With you, he wanted to add. The man snorted. I hope it does. He pointed to one of the 4 men behind him. Follow Polter here. He waved Ethnar away without another look. Polter, he set for the yards. Next. Ethnar shuffled over to Polter, a bulky Valorian man with a face so pocked it looked like Mamuna had set the chicken feed out on it one morning. Ethnar's feet slapped against stone as he stepped up beside Polter. Stones seemed to be everywhere in this place. The ground, the buildings, even statues of it. He doubted he'd seen a single patch of earth since they landed. He'd never worked with stone, but that didn't stop him from admiring the surrounding stonework, clearly crafted by masters. Mosaic carvings covered the ancient-looking walls, as detailed as the tapestries made by the Tumus clan. Even the stones cobbled in the street showed precise cuts and careful placement. Yet hundreds of Valorians clattered over them, hurrying to their next task, completely oblivious to the masterwork around them. It shouldn't have surprised him. These people already walked past him and the Fadan slaves without so much as a glance, unbothered by fellow humans bound and enslaved. Each one a masterwork of nature in their own right. Polter tied a rope around the cord on Ethnar's wrists, adding him to a line of 4 other slaves. Apparently, they hadn't reached their fill, because they stood and waited not too far behind the man sorting. The sun rose higher in the sky, and heat radiated off the surfaces around them. There was a tarp above the sorting table, casting a small amount of shade that Polter moved to take advantage of, while Ethnar and his 4 other rope mates stood in the sun, their backs sweating as they absorbed its heat. Merchants and slave traders frittered about the docks, and Ethnar realized something he'd missed earlier. They didn't scurry in greedy haste, as he'd assumed. They carried a sense of panic, repressed, but there. It showed in quick glances over their shoulders or in an over-readiness to laugh. One man's eyes darted constantly from side to side, hovering over his cargo while his slaves loaded it into a wagon. What had these people worried? Hey, stop gawking, slave, Polter said, pulling on the rope and bringing Ethnar around. We've got to get a move on. Ethnar hadn't noticed they'd finished filling their line. The first man on the rope dug in his feet, then puffed out his chest and spoke to Polter, each word slow as he labored with the Valorian consonants. He be champion. Polter threw his head back and laughed, then he bent low in a half-bow, curling both hands out away from himself as if holding up a dress. It was a common greeting or sign of respect Valorian women gave when wearing dresses, though Ethnar doubted it showed any of that here. In a former life it might have insulted Ethnar, now he felt nothing. Pardon me, your majesty, Polter said as he rose from the bow. Without warning, he charged, reaching for Ethnar's neck. Ethnar reacted by instinct, ducking under the man's arms and pushing his back down. Ethnar's corded wrists wrapped around Polter's own neck. His knee made it halfway to Polter's gut before he stopped himself. What was he doing? Ethnar's hesitation gave Polter a window, and he slammed his shoulder into Ethnar's chest, knocking him to the ground. This pulled the others on the rope, but they kept their feet. Polter stood above Ethnar, panting. I don't care if you were my ruddy grandmother before. You belong to Lord Debin now. Got it, champion? Ethnar inclined his head, bowing into the smooth stone. It is as you say. Polter looked around to see who was watching before yanking Ethnar to his feet and leaning in close. You touch me again, he whispered, and I'll kill you. Ethnar stared at the man. Had his pride really been wounded so badly by their minor scuffle that he'd kill over it? Despite having infinitely worse circumstances than the man, Ethnar pitied him. It sounded truly miserable to live life with your string drawn so tight that a simple pluck might snap it. What did the man have to live for? I will not forget it, Ethnar said with a slow bow of the head. Polter moved to the front of their rope and began pulling them along toward their destination. Ethnar plodded along in step, his mind caught on the same single thought. What did he have to live for? He kept scraping, kept bowing, kept complying to survive. Why? Why not just give up or die fighting? The only answer he could think of felt overly simplistic, but it was the only thing that seemed to fit. He had nothing to die for either. Chapter 6. The yards ended up being a collection of pillars with a clever combination of pulleys and weights that slid along ropes between them. A massive ship sat in the middle of the pillars. Ethnar didn't understand how they'd get a ship that size out to the ocean. As Polter walked them up to the ship, a crew of slaves lowered a huge beam down onto the half-finished deck of the ship. The slaves looked small compared to the beam, let alone the entire ship, like tiny stitches on a much larger canvas. Ethnar had seen pulleys, of course, but the clans didn't have the metal to make them, so he'd only seen a few limited applications used on sailing vessels before this. The uses here brought the usefulness of the technology to a whole new level. It's what allowed a ship of such size to even exist. He imagined the sleek Tahirian vessel from a few days earlier. Without the crag mason, the well-armed Tahirians could stand a chance against the slave ship, but what could they do against a ship like this? Meeks, Polter called up when they reached the base of the ship. Got 6 new hands for you. A balding man with too much weight on him and an enormous moustache poked his head out from the deck. The weight and the upper lip hair looked to be competing to see who could be the most excessive, and it looked like the moustache was barely winning. Why did some Valorians think it okay to shave hair off your chin, but not your lip? Ethnar didn't know of any religious rule against it, but it felt like it pushed against the laws of nature. The man popped back out of sight as quick as he'd appeared. I don't need more hands, Polter. I need more time. You know that. Lord Debin's orders, Polter said with a smirk. Besides, 2 of them are carpenters. Mix reappeared over the edge of the railing. Why didn't you say so? Send those 2 up. He waggled his hand in random directions. Have the others pull on a rope somewhere. A grey owl swooped over them, massive wingspan casting a shadow over Ethnar and the other slaves. He ducked, despite being out of reach of the bird's large talons, and he wasn't the only one. The owl landed in front of them and tilted its head, examining them. The dark black flecks across its chest gave it the look of a leopard as much as an owl. It had a large white face, almost flat, and its enormous orange eyes scrutinized the group, the black pupils narrowing. Polter thumbed toward the bird. Meeks is a manifest, controls an owl form. Not much slacking goes on round him. The owl rotated its head to look behind it, as if to emphasize Polter's point. Polter glared at the slaves in turn, ending on Ethnar, as if to say that slacking better not be a problem. Ethnar ignored him, eyes wide at the owl form in front of him. He looked up at Mix on the ship with new perspective. The balding man raised his eyebrows playfully. Ethnar shook his head in disbelief. To be gifted an animal form from nature and become a manifest was even rarer than being a crag mason. The entire Nialaran clan had only one manifest, an oryx antelope. Despite her growing age, she provided a great source of pride to the clan. She had been the one who had crowned Ethnar after his victory at the Festival of 5. Well, come on then, Mix said from above, his owl form motioning for them to follow with its wing. It glided softly around the ship and stopped at a rope ladder. Polter guided their group to the ladder, cut the first man free of the line and sent him up it. When it was Ethnar's turn, Polter gave him a scowl that said, "Don't try anything." A month ago, Ethnar would have rolled his eyes or taught the guy a lesson. Polter's false bravado wouldn't seem so tough if everyone he dealt with wasn't tied up. But now, Ethnar just stood passive while Polter cut him free. Ethnar flexed his fingers, appreciating the blood flow to them. It was the first time in a fortnight he hadn't been bound. Now he had a choice, with his hands free. What could he do? What couldn't he do? Polter certainly wouldn't pose much of a threat if Ethnar tried to leave. But where would he go? These people had likely had runaway slaves before, so they'd have processes in place to apprehend them. Even if he got away, what then? He had nothing. So he would stay here, not to mention all the things he could learn from the surrounding construction. He'd helped his father build boats for most of his life, and he'd never seen anything like this. Square quarried stones surrounded the ship, anchoring it in place with cords. Amazingly, these same weighted anchors also hung from different ropes dangling from the tall pillars, counterbalancing or helping to lift enormous boards from a massive pile onto the ship. "Polter, get those slaves up the rope so I can go inspect my ship," said a voice behind them. Ethnar turned to see the dark crag mason walking toward them. He'd changed out of the outfit he'd worn at sea. He now wore a silky black shirt. "Yes, Lord Debin," Polter said with a bow of the head. He shoved Ethnar toward the rope ladder. "I'd love to see you try something now," he said into Ethnar's ear. Ethnar had been thinking similarly. If he'd tried to mount some sort of escape a moment ago, the crag mason, Lord Debin apparently, would have stopped him right there. Without waiting to get told again, Ethnar hurried up the ladder. The railing wrapped around the ship, looking finished, but only about half of the deck was walkable. Fortunately, the rope ladder led them up to the finished side. Mix directed the team of slaves, lowering in the large beam via the pulley system. It looked like it would support the rest of the deck, help the hull keep shape, and hold up the mast. Mix shouted out orders and directions, hands resting in his work apron, while the slaves grunted in exertion. Once the beam looked more or less in place, Mix ran over, pulling out a small wooden triangle with a pendulum on it from his apron pocket. He laid the triangle onto the beam, stilling the pendulum. He looked at it, then hit the beam with a hammer, also from his apron, and looked again. Ethnar's eyebrows raised as he realized the function of the triangle tool. If the pendulum hung off-center, their work wasn't straight. How did the Valorians come up with such things? "Good," shouted Mix. "Get over here." A crew of men with heavy metal brackets, handrails, and wet wooden pegs ran over to Mix. Despite hanging over an edge of a 20-foot or more drop, the crew set to work, drilling holes and pounding in fasteners. They worked feverishly, the other slaves holding up the beam. Mix hovered close, monitoring his triangle tool. His alform perched on the other side of the beam at the front of the ship with a triangle tool of its own. A crew worked there as well, putting in an identical set of brackets and fasteners. After a minute or two of frantic work, the crews leaned back with sighs of relief. Mix clapped his hands excitedly. All clear. The half-dozen slaves on deck sagged, letting go of the line. They moved over to a water barrel near them and rationed out water. Ethnar watched it all in wonder. They'd accomplished all that in a matter of minutes. Still, he frowned as the slaves rubbed sore shoulders and poured water onto raw hands. These Valorians made some incredible things, but at much too high a cost. "Excellent work, Mix," Lord Debin said from behind Ethnar, "but I expected you to have the deck finished when I returned." Mix's face darkened. "The winds favored your journey, and you returned sooner than expected." Lord Debin stepped past Ethnar, flicking his blonde hair out of his face. "Only by a day, Mix, and it looks like you've got more than that left to do here." "I'll finish in time." Lord Debin raised an eyebrow as he looked over the crews of slaves. Most of them still leaned over, catching their breath from the labor. "In time is 3 days." Lord Debin towered over the portly Mix. "Our scouts say Derask's army will be here in 3 days. They're led by the captain of the Paladins, a manifest. Their numbers are fairly close to ours, but their reputation has most of the guild spooked. If the guild's forces fall, I won't flee like a whimpering dog. I will retreat in the Indomitable, the greatest vessel the ocean has ever seen, capable of taking any port of my choosing." Ethnar's breath caught. He'd heard of Deruskan, a mercenary not too unlike himself, only rich, and powerful apparently. People said he was somewhat of an idealist, set on righting Valoria's wrongs. Looks like he'd made some progress in that department. What did that change for Ethnar? Nothing for the present. If an opposing army invaded, that could certainly provide opportunities for escape. With what he'd heard about Darask, they probably came to liberate the slaves, so escape wouldn't even be necessary. If Ethnar just waited it out, nature's true heroes would settle this. His thoughts caught on the image of Lord Debin sailing the seas in an enormous juggernaut, and his shoulders slumped. Lord Debin alone might be enough to sway the tide of the battle with Darask's forces. In line with his new normal, Ethnar's hopes ended because of the Crag Mason. Debin. The shout came from behind them. Ethnar whipped around. A woman holding a bow and arrow emerged on top of the pile of boards that stood nearly as high as the ship. To his side, Lord Debin rolled, narrowly avoiding the arrow that thudded against the deck of the ship, where he'd just stood. The arrow had come from above them, not the woman. On top of a pillar off to Ethnar's right, a hooded archer perched, pulling out another arrow. Ethnar cursed himself for not having noticed the man earlier. He had allowed himself to get caught up in the pulleys and amazing constructions. The archer's shot had been a long one, probably so he could stay out of range of Lord Debin's ability. While his position on top of the pillar had made for a clear shot, it made his retreat precarious, if not impossible. Mix flew toward the archer in his owl form, but before he got anywhere close, the female archer launched her own arrow, landing it right in the small of the hooded archer's back. Not an easy shot. The archer fell, hitting the ground below with a thud, his body twisted in an awkward lump. If the arrow hadn't killed the man, the fall surely had. Ethnar pitied him. Eliminating Lord Debin was certainly a worthy goal, despite the man's motives. "Jax," Lord Debin roared. The woman turned, a smug look on her face. In the rush of it all, Ethnar hadn't realized she was Tahirian. Tahirians didn't train their women in the art of war. Where had she gotten so good with a bow? "You're supposed to take them out before they shoot." The woman, Jax, shrugged. She looked young to be a slave lord's bodyguard, probably a year or two Ethnar's junior. How had she ended up here? Lord Debin straightened his shirt. "Do I need to remind you that your payments end if I die?" The woman huffed, a fire behind her dark eyes. "I just saved your life, eh?" Her thick accent marked each word. "You pay me so that another archer doesn't shoot you, and no archer has. Now let me go and make sure no one else is hanging around." She flung herself down the pile of boards and scurried off. Amazing. What a story she must have to tell, though a story ending with you as a bodyguard to Lord Debin couldn't be a cheerful one. It made sense that Lord Debin had an archer as a bodyguard. Archers were presumably the only warriors who could threaten him, though they had to take a pretty long shot to stay out of his ability's range. Lord Debin walked over to the edge of the ship and peered down at the corpse of the archer. "Fools," he muttered. Mick shuffled up beside him, face glum. "Do you think he was from Lord Aquilan? Revenge for your, time with his daughter?" "Or Lord Halifa's," Lord Debin said, vying for my spot as guild leader. "Or any other dozen personal vendettas of parents whose children I've made into slaves, or husbands whose wives I've coerced." Ethnar's gut churned with the little amount of soap he'd had for breakfast. Screams tugged at his mind almost constantly, but at least his family hadn't been tortured and abused first. Lord Debin chuckled and put a hand on Mix's shoulder. "You know, Mix, when you own the world, it's still a heavy cost for doing whatever you like. Others think they can take it from you." He nodded to the corpse below. Mix pulled his head back in a look of disgust, but covered it in an instant, bowing in acknowledgement. Lord Debin tightened his grip on Mix's shoulder, and Mix shuffled in discomfort. 3 days and we're setting sail. Make sure you're ready." He released Mix and strolled over to the ladder, lowering himself off the deck. Ethnar only then realized he'd balled his hands into fists. If killing Lord Debin was the only other thing he accomplished in life, it would be well worth it. He looked down at the crumpled, lifeless body of the archer. Problem was, no one knew how. Chapter 7. Ethnar's eyes skimmed across the tools laid out on the table in front of him. Any of them would serve well enough as a weapon for him, but that's not why he eyed them so intently. Tools similar to what his father had used only made up the top right corner of the table, and dozens more spread across the whole thing. What his father wouldn't have given for such a selection of tools. Some tools he could clearly see a use for, and others must have had such a specialized application that he couldn't figure out their purpose. He stood on the finished half of the deck with the other carpenter, awaiting assignment from Mix. Workers buzzed around him, and Mix, who seemingly ran everything, had only just sat down in the chair behind the table. "Ask him which ones he's familiar with," Mix said to a thin clansman beside him. Tumu's clan, if Ethnar had to guess. Mix pointed at Ethnar. Polter also stood behind the table, glaring at anyone who looked in his direction. Ethnar held his chin up. "I understand you quite well." He pointed to the top right corner of the table. "I have used tools similar to these." Mix looked up sharply, a sort of hunger in his eyes. "Boats? You made boats?" Ethnar nodded. "Nialaran, you've got to be Nialaran then?" Mix asked, leaning forward. Again Ethnar nodded. Mix shook his fist in celebration, practically doing a jig. "I love the decorative designs you folks put on the sides of your boats. I'm intending for something similar to your lattice pattern as a border around Lord Debin's quarters." Ethnar didn't know how to react to the man's outburst, while he knew exactly the pattern Mix referred to. His father had always been the one to carve it onto the sides of the boats. Ethnar had only practiced it on scratchwood. He'd never earned the honor to put it onto a vessel. Even as a slave, Ethnar couldn't get away from expectations. Mix stood and walked off, gesturing for Ethnar to follow. Come, let me show you." "Mix," Polter said as Ethnar moved to follow, "you need to give him the warning concerning tools. This one has only been off-boat for several hours and has shown he's still quite prone to savagery." Mix waved him off and kept walking. Yes, you've been given a real opportunity, blah, blah, blah. You use these tools for violence and we'll kill you. No time for anything else. Bowmen have been placed all over the yards." He pointed to several men holding crossbows sitting on the fences surrounding the yards. "Besides, you're not all that savage, are you? He stopped to look Ethnar in the eye, brow furrowing. "What's your name, clansman?" Ethnar swallowed, mouth dry, as he came around the table. He'd carried a name and position of pride only weeks before. Now it felt shameful to mention who he was. "Champion," Polter said, his voice thick with mockery. "His name is Champion." "Thank you." Mix dipped his head toward Polter. "Well, a craftsman like you can't be all that savage, eh, Champion?" Ethnar said nothing. The question struck him as ironic. He certainly hadn't been a savage, not before these people had interfered anyway. Still, he didn't know how much more it would take before he snapped completely and rampaged, just to make the screams go away. Savage might not be too far off. Mix cleared his throat. "As I was saying, I have a pattern for you." He led Ethnar back across the completed portion of the deck. At the rear of the ship, the deck raised to a second level for the helm equipment, and the main deck continued to a door built under the higher deck. It opened up into a large space, windows lining the back wall. Several craftsmen worked in the space already, one carving the posts of an enormous bed frame. The other two worked on carvings of lions beneath the windowsills. Mix pulled over a ladder from the corner and scrambled up it, pointing to the wall above where they'd entered. About 3 feet of a complex crisscrossing pattern had been etched into the wood there. "I started here, you see, but it needs to go all the way around the room." Ethnar scanned the room, visualizing the finished pattern. It would take a lot of work, probably not possible in 3 days, even if both he and Mix worked on it. "Isn't this a little frivolous when you need to be finished in 3 days?" he said. Not that he cared much about their deadline. The job had simply surprised him. He'd expected to be sliding floorboards together or building stairs down into the hull. "Frivolous?" Mix said, eyebrows raising at Ethnar. "Most definitely. But this is what Lord Debin means when he says finished. He wants to travel in comfort. If the Indomitable sails and he's got luxury alongside a few ballistae, He couldn't care less whether the crew has proper quarters, or even if the deck is all finished. Mick eyed Ethnar up and down, possibly taking in his thick arms and defined torso for the first time. Besides, that's nothing for you to worry about, champion. Now get up there and show me what you can do. Ethnar climbed the ladder, noting a basket attached at the top holding the knives he'd need. He grabbed one, noting the size and weight of it in his hand. He ran his other hand across the pattern Mix had made so far, closing his eyes. In an instant he was back in time, his father's thick, calloused hands guiding his through the pattern. His father had died years ago, long before the Watani attack, but the death still stung, a wound that hadn't been allowed to heal. Ethnar hadn't been there, he could have been there. It had made him wonder why life had to be so hard. Now he didn't worry about such things. Life was hard, no utility in trying to figure out why. He opened his eyes to find Mick staring at him. He blew some loose shavings off the pattern and patted it gently. I'll carve this pattern for you. No need to worry about me. Ethnar ran his thumb over the last few inches of his work. Good enough. He'd only worked on the pattern for several hours, but he found out quickly that he would need to work at a frenetic pace to get this done. He'd only progressed several feet with the pattern, and he still had 3.5 walls to go. His father would criticize such hastiness, but the urgency filled the air, intoxicating everyone. Not just Ethnar. Mix rushed in and out, directing one person here or there. Several workers finished the bed frame and hauled in a mattress. Dozens of workers laid floorboards down onto the deck. They worked like men possessed, and Ethnar had to wonder what motivated them all. Could they all be afraid of Lord Debin? Ethnar flexed his fingers. Despite vigilance in maintaining his body for combat, the carving still required motions from his hands that he hadn't performed in years. He picked up his chisel and started again. Mix had called the pattern a lattice, but Ethnar's people called it the endless rope. It twisted and wove without ever coming to an end. Everything connected, everything eternal. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about his last interaction with his father. He had been working on this very pattern, his last practice run before being allowed to put the pattern onto a boat. They had worked on the beach as they always did, a shout's distance from their family home. An array of several different boats and logs lined the beach, raised up from the sand on stilts that put them at hip height. Ethnar presented the endless rope to his father, hopeful. Father looked over the work for only a moment before scrunching his brow and examining Ethnar. You have captured the whole of the rope very well, understanding the ebbs and flows, but your detail work is hasty. You need to make the intersections here sharper, the cuts deeper. Ethnar kept himself from groaning. That would all but guarantee his needing to repeat the exercise before getting full license to carve the endless rope on ships. Hasty? He'd spent 3 days on this rope, hours on the very intersections his father had just pointed out. Luckily for you, his father said, handing him the board, you have no errors. Another half day of work and you should have it. He smiled encouragingly. Father had a large gap between his 2 front teeth, and somehow seeing that gap could be the friendliest thing, just not to die. Ethnar took the board and swallowed uncomfortably. Had father forgotten? I'm leaving with the caravan today, Ethnar said cautiously. I probably should have left to join them already. Father turned away, picking up a chisel and mallet. So you've decided to go after all, even though I counseled against it. Ethnar pursed his lips and took a deep breath before speaking. I can earn half a year's worth of earnings on one trip. So you've said. Ethnar wanted to scream at his father, but that would prove nothing but weakness. I'm getting very good at the things they are teaching me, father. Coulson says I might be able to represent our clan in the arena someday. His father gave no visual response, scraping away at the inside of the current boat. Any man can stab a knife into another man. Only an artist with years of dedication can make an endless rope. Actually, it's the dedication and attention to detail that you taught me that makes me so good in combat. Father said nothing, his repeated scraping motions across the inside of the soon-to-be boat, matching the swell of the tide as it lapped against the beach. I'm doing this, Ethnar said. I can be a warrior and a carpenter. You'll see. He shook the board in his hand. I will make this endless rope perfect while I'm gone. I only hope you can be proud of me, as I represent our clan in combat as well." Ethnar stormed away, not looking back as he headed to meet up with the caravan. When he returned after 6 weeks, he found the household in mourning. The half-finished boats that had lined the beach outside their home for as long as he could remember had been pulled up near the house. Ethnar could have dragged them back out and continued his father's work, but he didn't. He took another caravan job a week later. "Wow, you carve like this pattern has been etched into your soul." Ethnar jerked around but immediately relaxed when he saw Mix enter into the cabin with a young woman. Mix raised an eyebrow at him, and Ethnar followed the man's gaze, down to where his own hand gripped the chisel tightly, like a knife. He set the chisel down in an instant. No one had startled him like that in a long time. "Champion, this is my daughter," Mix said, pointing to the young woman. "Looks just like her late mother. Nature bless her soul." Ethnar descended the ladder he stood on and bowed his head in respect. The young woman, maybe 15 or 16 years old, smiled uncomfortably and looked to Mix for direction. She must have looked like her mother because her figure was lithe and athletic, nothing like her father who was built more like a barrel. The strong cheekbones and thin neck also gave a very different appearance than the manifest. In fact, she looked nothing like Mix except for maybe the smile lines around the eyes. They held the same tease that he'd seen from Mix. "She's here to put the finishing touches on the decals," Mix said, holding up a set of thin artisan chisels. "She inherited the best part of me without any of the other baggage." He patted his belly. The young woman rolled her eyes and grabbed the chisels from her father. She got straight to work. They had a deadline after all. Mix grabbed a ladder and worked on the endless rope in the opposite direction from Ethnar, though he complained about how his work didn't look as good as Ethnar's the whole time. Ethnar did not know what to say because he completely agreed. After a couple of hours, Mix's daughter excused herself, and Mix sent her away with a kiss on the head. Ethnar had to admit that the lines beneath the windows and the vine carved around the bed frame looked immensely better with her touch. "She's quite talented," Champion said to Mix after she'd gone. Mix set down his mallet, his chest puffing out. Understatement if I ever heard one. He looked proud, as all fathers should, but then his face fell into a sad smile as he relaxed his chest. "She's my whole world." He shook his head. "I don't know what will happen to her when this army arrives." Even though Ethnar had no children, he understood the concern. What would happen to any of them when the army arrived? Ethnar wiped his brow, arms aching as he lifted them above his head to continue on the carving. He'd worked hard the past 3 days, but he still had so much to do. He'd finished 3 of the walls and had just started in on the 4th. They only had 9, maybe 10 hours before sunrise, though Ethnar didn't know if that was the actual deadline. Maybe Lord Debin would come see them at noon, or, if the invasion proved much weaker than anticipated, not at all. Mix walked into the cabin with a lantern. Ethnar hadn't noticed how dim the light had become, the setting sun dipping behind the horizon. Mix tapped Polter on the shoulder. The thick guard sat half awake by the door. "You can go," Mix said to him. "I can handle 1 slave. Those out with the main mast are all from Lord Debin's personal retinue, as trustworthy as any of us." Polter yawned and nodded, leaving the room. Mix set the lantern onto the ornate table bolted to the floor in the center of the room. "You should get some rest too, you know. You've worked yourself rugged these past few days." Ethnar ignored him, chiseling away at the loop he'd just made. Mix wandered over to the ladder, hand absent-mindedly fiddling with his mustache. "What are you doing this for, lad? You certainly don't care about Lord Debin's bedchamber." Ethnar grabbed some grit paper and moved it across the wood. "Your deadline is tomorrow." An enormous crew had moved the main mast into place earlier that day, but another crew still worked to secure it. For now, ropes and pulleys held the tall wooden pillar upright. They'd still have to see if they have it ready by morning. How would Lord Debin punish them if it wasn't done? Ethnar might learn for himself as well if he didn't hurry up. Mix handed him a shavings brush. "Well, I thank you kindly, but I don't think you're doing it for my sake either." Ethnar remained silent, partly because he didn't know how to answer. Did he tell this man that the work was better than screams in his head? He'd thrown himself into the work, grateful for how much it required his focus. He looked at the endless rope, searching its eternal ins and outs for an answer. Sure, it distracted him, but why had he attacked it with such fervor? Mix tapped the ladder and moved over to his own, carving on the other side of the wall. For a time, only the soft scraping of knife against wood echoed in the room. The lantern light flickered, creating squiggly shadows with all the different rungs on the ladders. "Why are you doing this?" Ethnar finally asked. "I've watched you. You treat us slaves with more or less respect, ask us our names. You're horrified by what Lord Debin does. I saw it on your face that first day. Why do you help him?" Soft clink sounded as Mix tapped into his chisel with the rounded mallet. Ethnar waited, not saying anything, as he saw Mix struggle with the question. The blows on the chisel grew in intensity, beads of sweat reflecting the lantern light off Mix's head. Mix had worked practically without stopping the last 3 days, and it was starting to show in the bags under his eyes and the slight shake in his hands. Mix struck the mallet onto his chisel again and again, each strike harder than the last, until finally he threw his chisel aside and pounded the mallet into the wall several times. With a whimper, he scrunched his face and sagged down onto his ladder, sitting in a ball on the top step. Ethnar held his breath. It felt like a breakdown he wasn't meant to see, not as a craftsman and certainly not as a slave. Still, he hoped that Mix would answer his question. After a long moment of silence, Mix spoke. "Lad, there are more types of chains than ones made of metal. My whole world is at stake." At first Ethnar didn't understand, but then he exhaled as realization hit him. "Your daughter, Lord Debin." Mix shook his head forcefully. Don't say it. It will never happen if I keep him happy." Ethnar thought he understood, but couldn't repress his frustration entirely. This man had been bestowed with a manifestation by nature. Couldn't he stand up to evil like Lord Debin? Mix pointed to the wall. "At least this way I get to feel productive. I make beautiful things, incredible things. They're added to the world by my hand." Ethnar nodded. That made sense. "That's probably why I've worked so eagerly as well," he said. "I've actually been able to do something, to create rather than take away. Here, I feel like what I'm doing will last. When I choose to protect and then fail, it is all for naught. I have nothing left to show for my efforts. If he'd stayed and worked with Father all those years ago, he'd still be working on boats, carving in endless ropes for the fishermen of his village. No one would have killed the Watani champion, and his village of Nekut would never have been burned. Throwing himself into woodwork was what he should have done all along." Mix looked over at him. "I'm sorry," and Ethnar swallowed, glancing away. "I will make due." Mix raised an eyebrow and pointed down at Ethnar's hands. They were shaking. Ethnar clapped his hands on his thighs and trying to control himself. "A couple of fine artisans we make." Unable to bring his hands under control enough to carve, Ethnar stepped down his ladder and began gathering scraps and boards left by the other craftsmen. He knelt and stacked them into neat piles next to the door. "You don't need to treat them like that," Mix said, brushing wood shavings from his mustache. "They're getting thrown into the trash heap anyway." "Mix!" The shout came from outside the ship. Through the back windows, Ethnar could see a young slave running toward the ship, a torch in one hand and a letter in the other. Mix's owl form swooped down and retrieved the message, opening it with its beak. Ethnar looked back to Mix's human form. Mix furrowed his brow as he read through his owl form. He caught Ethnar staring and blushed ever so slightly before hopping off the ladder and moving toward the door. "Sorry, I've got to go. Some 200 slaves at the stone quarry down the road have revolted, killing their taskmasters. Lord Debin wants me to scope." Mix stopped when he looked back at Ethnar. Ethnar didn't know if it was because he realized who he was talking to or because Ethnar's face likely looked horrified. It had to be Tassak. Ethnar's stomach dropped. The boy had gotten himself in trouble after all, and Ethnar wasn't around to help. He couldn't ask Mix who it was outright, not with how the manifest had jumped up at a moment's notice to do Lord Debin's bidding. But maybe he could come at it sideways. "Eninyalaran?" Mix waved him off absent-mindedly, already heading out the door with the lantern. "No, the note says Fadan. Now you don't get into any trouble while I'm gone." Fadan saw it was Tassak. What is Lord Debin going to do? His voice tremored slightly. Hopefully Mix hadn't noticed. Mix looked down at the floor, avoiding Ethnar's gaze and fumbling with the keys at his belt. Normally he tries to preserve as much stock as he can and only publicly executes the leaders. But with Daresk's army likely attacking in the morning, Lord Debin will probably just be rid of them. Mix closed the door, plunging Ethnar into darkness. Ethnar stood feeling his way forward. He cursed foolish Tassak if he had only waited one more day. But they had no guarantee that the invading army would win, or even that it would free them. Tassak had probably timed the revolt to complicate things for the city's defense. And now he was going to die. Ethnar kicked the boards in front of him in frustration, scattering them across the floor, unsure of what he should do in all this. With a sound of finality, the lock on the door clicked into place as Mix turned the key. Chapter 8. At first the sound of the lock infuriated Ethnar. Hadn't he and Mix just trusted each other with extremely personal insecurities, and now Mix couldn't trust him with an unlocked door? But the more he thought, the more he remembered his place. He was a slave. He slumped onto the floor, hating himself. I had thought Mix a coward for refusing to stand up to Lord Debin because of the bestowed he'd received from nature, and yet hadn't Ethnar received his own gifts from nature? He was the champion of the Festival of Five, greatest warrior of the northern clans, bestowed or otherwise. And he sat on the floor in the dark, moping with the scrap wood, ready to be swept off and thrown away. But what else could he do? Lord Debin had proved repeatedly that he could defeat Ethnar. A flicker of passing torchlight from outside the window flashed across the endless rope he'd carved the past several days. He wanted to be useful. He wouldn't just die needlessly in combat. He needed to die for something. The screams of his village assaulted him full force, stealing the breath from him. Mamuna, his sister, Belana. He heard each one, the unique tremor of each scream. He heard them in his mind individually and collectively, all at once. They had trusted him, and now they were all dead. Everyone who had depended on Ethnar for protection was dead. Him fighting equaled a death sentence. For others. If he fought for Tassak, he would only make things worse. In a craze, Ethnar thrashed about, throwing the scraps of wood around him, smashing them against the walls and breaking them into pieces. They were getting thrown in the trash heap anyway. The scream stopped as Ethnar's gaze fixed on what he could see of the wooden scraps and splinters around him. Those scraps were getting thrown into the trash heap anyway. Things couldn't get worse for Tassak and his men. They were going to die anyway. If Ethnar saved even one, he'd have died for something. After losing his village, Ethnar had wondered who he could fight for, who he could protect if he endangered them even more. Now he realized the one group he could fight for. Ethnar could fight for the condemned. Chapter 9. Ethnar rushed to the window, grabbed the ladder in stride and smashed it through the newly installed glass. Mix would have to forgive him. He stepped outside the window, grateful he could reach one of the ropes in the pulley system. He pulled himself up with it, getting a foothold on a ledge carved above the window and grabbing hold of the railing of the deck above. Once on deck, he hurried down the stairs. The 8 men working to fasten the mast looked up at his disturbance. Mix had said they were trustworthy, meaning they were loyal to Lord Debin. "He's escaped," shouted one, pointing with the stick he was using to spread pitch between the floorboards. Another, a big brute of a man, dropped the wooden peg he held and stood up. It looked like he descended from the Barut clan, only they seemed to get that big, though Ethnar doubted this man ever lived in the northern lands. The man eyed Ethnar, who stopped. He could try to outmaneuver this man and beat him down the ladder, but that didn't help his situation much. Trying to sneak in and save Tassak wouldn't work too well with a group of men giving chase. Besides, he still hadn't figured out what he would do about Lord Debin. "You just turn right around and crawl back to where you're supposed to." The large man nodded to the door. "Makes things easier for you and for all of us." "Or what?" The man laughed, his enormous chest bouncing slightly. He didn't have as defined muscles as Ethnar, but they were definitely bigger, by a lot. Ethnar didn't care. I know you're more afraid of Lord Debin than you are of me. I get that, Ethnar said as the man moved closer, but I'm vying for second place in the to-be-feared category. Ethnar struck out, catching the man in the nose with his palm. Before the man could react, Ethnar caught him by the back of the neck and shoved him to the deck. The man flailed, but Ethnar trapped his beefy arms and pulled them up behind the man until he flinched with pain. Finally, he pressed his knee down on the man's neck, suffocating him with the pressure. He'd used this hold many times to get his opponents in the ring to tap out. Only one other man approached after that, the others frozen in stunned surprise. He swung the rod in his hands, a lever of some sort. It slapped against Ethnar's prepared palm before he wrenched it from the man's grip and flicked it against the man's head. A warning. Ethnar released the man beneath him, who coughed and sputtered for breath. "Get off this boat." Ethnar pointed to the ladder with the rod. "I don't care who you go tell, just get away from here." The men scrambled over each other to get away, tipping over their barrel of pitch. A calm determination settled over Ethnar, one developed through years of fighting in the arena. It almost felt like coming home after a caravan job. Ethnar ran his fingers over the metal rod in his hands. It didn't have the weight to one side like his trident, but the shaft looked like it could withstand several blows from any weapon smaller than a battle axe. He spun it around himself, testing its weight. It would suffice for everyone except Lord Debin, and maybe that Jack's archer woman. What he was going to do about them, he still had no clue. He didn't know how much time he had before Lord Debin killed Tassak and his men. That he'd wanted Mix to scout things out gave Ethnar a little hope that he still had time. He scanned his surroundings for ideas, something, anything. Dozens of ropes and pulleys wove around the deck, most of them tied around the large mast. They reminded Ethnar of the fish nets from his village, and the one he carried with him into the arena for nearly every fight. Sometimes, when an opponent protected themselves well from his trident, all he had to do was tangle them in his net. An idea began to form in his mind. As a youth, he charged a fairly high price, in his village at least, to make the special fish traps he wove. Fishermen didn't just put up the money without some forethought. More often than not, they came to him when their usual methods weren't working and they needed something else. Ethnar scurried over to the departed men's tools, throwing them to the side until he found a saw. He counted the ropes holding the mast and then dug the saw into the one on his right. Ethnar's usual methods hadn't worked with Lord Debin. It was time to try something else. What he needed was a trap. Chapter 10. Jax cursed as she shimmied out over the rock she'd chosen. It had taken her close to an hour to reach this spot without notice, and it still only gave her a clear shot at two of the sentries the little rebels had posted. They'd holed up in the equivalent of a small fort of stacked boulders and piled rocks, backs against the mountain. It had next to no vegetation, so the slaves didn't have any cover if they tried to escape. Lord Debin's bowmen would shoot them down without much need of help from her. Mix had told her it would be perfect up here. She huffed. What did the All-Architect know about battle? The 3 total sentries she could see carried crossbows, taken from their taskmasters or guards or whatever. Not an easy task to get those. Good for them. She scrunched her face as she realized that more than likely someone had just taken the arrow for them. See, that's why she hated soldier work. It got messy and all because 2 groups saw something a little different. It was why she'd left her last job. She told Debin that she would not do outside work for him. Yet here she was, splayed out on a rock, about to shoot some kid who'd had little to no combat training. Not only was it boring, but it also left a sick feeling in her stomach. When you acted as a bodyguard, the other guy had the bad intentions first. Sure, she protected one of the most despicable men she'd ever seen, but he paid well. Besides, it wasn't like Debin was the only slave lord around. Kill him and someone else takes his place. It wouldn't do the world any favors. It just settled a score. Jax didn't mind profiting off of ruining someone else's revenge. But this was different. Debin had said these slaves could come up from behind while they battled with Derask's forces, possibly resulting in a loss for the guild and death or execution for Debin. That made sense. It still didn't feel like the realm of a bodyguard. Jack shook her head. She'd finish this job, then she'd take off. Nature knew she'd saved up a pretty penny over the last few years of work. A tiny rustle sounded behind her, hardly anything but enough for her trained ear to move her into action. Her hand found her dagger, almost instantly. She whirled, plunging the dagger into the assailant's knee. A firm hand caught her wrist. A clansman slave stood opposite her. He held a metal rod and wore nothing apart from knee-length trousers. Though they looked so worn and tattered, they could hardly count for clothes. Only by sheer reflex did she get her bow up in time to block the man's swing at her ribs. The wood crunched as the rod broke off a chunk of the bow. She groaned. This bow cost a small fortune. With the pain-inducing twist of her wrist, the man forced her to drop her dagger. Then he pulled her closer with that same arm, bringing his knee upward to strike her gut. She rolled out of his grip, putting them back to back for a split second before she pushed off. The man's rod swung down toward her head and slammed into her bow with a crack. It was then she realized she had larger things to worry about, beyond how much it would cost to replace her bow. This wasn't some fisherman who'd luckily approached without detection. This was a warrior. She took a quick glance around the man, looking for her dagger. Without turning, the man slid the dagger off the rock with the heel of his bare foot. It clinked as it tumbled down the mountainside. Great. The sentries below would certainly have heard the dagger fall, and she'd have to change position. If she didn't get killed first. The man swung the rod around again, this time with two hands, pulling it out wide to gain momentum. This left his ribs open. Jax moved into the attack, reaching for the small carving knife at her belt. Anticipating her move, the man dropped the rod mid-strike, and she knew she'd made a mistake. He'd baited her to move forward. His left arm pulled her head in and moved to wrap around her neck from behind. She pulled back in time, keeping her head out of his chokehold. But his other hand clasped hers as she drew the carving knife. He pulled backward, falling to the ground and yanking her with him. She had trained for grappling, even won some bets by goading big men into wrestling matches in bars. But this guy knew what he was doing. Even if she were his equal in grappling knowledge, his size and strength would overwhelm her if she didn't do something fast. She brought her elbow down into his sternum as they landed, putting her full weight into it. He grunted as he took her hit, but it did nothing to stop his next attack. His legs swung up and around in a fluid motion, never really hitting the ground when he fell. He yanked her arm up between him as his legs pinned her chest and head to the ground. His ankles locked and she knew she was done for. She'd fought a lot in her life, especially for one so young, but she'd only felt the fear of death a few times. Few people possessed the skills to do that to her. As an archer, she normally eliminated enemies long before they could threaten her anyway. That fear encompassed her now, and she screamed as her arm snapped at the elbow. The carving knife fell harmlessly from her fingers. The slave released his hold on her, and Jax curled into a ball cradling her broken arm. She began a prayer in Tahirian that her mother had taught her. She hadn't thought that would be the last thing she'd say in this life. She couldn't help but close her eyes and tense her shoulders as she waited for the blow to come. The man only had a rod. Maybe she'd get lucky and black out on the first blow. She finished the prayer. It normally took a good half-minute, though she might have recited it a little fast. Maybe the man was letting her say her last words before finishing her. She opened her eyes and looked up. The man had grabbed the bow next to her and leaned it up against a rock. She winced as he kicked it right where the rod had cracked the wood. The weapon snapped in two. He looked at her then, panting as sweat trickled down his forehead. "I suggest you seek employment elsewhere," he said, face impassive. "What?" She might be young, but she wasn't naive. She'd been in the business enough to know this isn't how things worked. She'd been on the other end of this very transaction and never hesitated. Loose ends could end up killing you. Outwardly, Jax nodded her head furiously. I will. Then she paused before continuing. The man stood between her and the dropped carving knife. Had he done that on purpose? "Are you going to kill him with a bow?" she asked. The man set his jaw. "I'm going to kill him, yes." Wow, confidence. She liked that. Still, he'd missed the point. "But with a bow?" She sat up slightly. "Are you going to kill him with a bow?" his brow furrowed in confusion. Not with a bow. I am only average. Jax looked up and down his muscled torso. She doubted that. She put her good hand up in an innocent gesture. When Debin hired me, he said my job was to make sure no one shot him. Looks like we're good. The man's lip twitched, had he almost smiled at her joke. Good, I expect I will not see you at all then in the coming hours. He looked down at her as if seeking confirmation. Absolutely, she nodded. Not a sign of me. He really was going to just let her go. The man sighed in relief. Wasn't signing her job right now? Looking her over, he tore off a piece of his ragged pants and reached down to grab a straight piece of the bow he'd just obliterated. For a splint. He handed the cloth and wood to her, pointing to her arm. Jax blinked. Chivalry. Why didn't you just kill me? The man stooped down to look her in the eyes. I killed a man once. It destroyed my whole family. From now on, Lord Debin's life is the only other life I will ever take. His eyes burned in a controlled blaze. It is not right for one man to decide if another man should die. A man's life, his soul, is too large for me, or anyone, to know if ending it would be the right thing. She raised an eyebrow at him. Except for Debin. I only said that I would never know if it was the right thing. He stood up, gripping his rod and looking down at the soldiers surrounding the quarry. In Lord Debin's case, I don't care. Chapter 11. Ethnar sprinted down the mountain, doing his best to keep his feet under him. The darkness of dusk made seeing his path difficult. He panted as he ran, almost in relief. Defeating Jax had gone just as he'd hoped, and it opened up the possibility for the rest of his plan to work. During the fight with Jax, he'd honed in his focus, almost imagining himself in the ring, and in the ring he was champion. But now, hurtling down the slope toward Lord Debin and dozens of his men, his confidence waned. The soldiers closest to him had seen his fight with Jax, and several of them pointed crossbows in his direction, waiting for him to come into range. Thankfully, the rest of the soldiers he could see still had their sights focused on the rebels. Large stones littered the quarry, ghostly monoliths of light grey standing out in the darkening night. The stones would provide plenty of cover, but Ethnar had to get there first. The best cover he had right now was some taller sage, not very effective at stopping a crossbow bolt. Scanning the battlefield, he could see the soldiers had scattered themselves into squads of 4 or 5 and spread out among the rocks. Good, he wouldn't have to fight a large group all at once. Lord Debin worked with a group of engineers, holding torches and prepping a catapult, of all things. That was one way to finish things quickly. He likely needed the weapon on the walls for the upcoming assault, which meant Ethnar didn't have much time. The engineers slopped a black goo onto what looked like a big woven ball of wooden sticks, likely that Parotar Lord Debin had used back on the ship. If they launched that into the rebels' makeshift fort, who knew how many lives it might take? It would smoke the rebels out into a slaughter at the very least. He needed to destroy that catapult. A crossbow bolt hit at his feet, but maybe focusing on getting to cover would be best for now. Tassak, Ethnar yelled, glancing over to where the slaves hid. The Fadan had holed up in a nice little collection of rock, practically a cave. Now that he saw their setup, Ethnar believed he understood Tassak's strategy. Pulling them out of a position like that would be tough, even with Lord Debin's ability. The smart thing to do would be to just wait them out, make the slaves dehydrate and starve before moving in. But Lord Debin didn't have time for that. Tassak peeked his head over the rock for a brief second. Champion. His voice echoed, sounding pleased. Could you draw their attention for a brief moment? Ethnar asked in Hota. Quickly! In response, 4 crossbow bolts flew out from the collection of stones, forcing the soldiers nearest Ethnar back behind cover. It didn't give Ethnar long, but the gap proved enough for him to run behind a big boulder, very capable of arrow stopping. Ethnar darted from one rock to the next until he found a squad of men. He couldn't stay in one spot, or Lord Debin would root him out. He bashed his rod down onto the first man's helmet before twisting it around to block the next soldier's sword. Ethnar swept his leg around, catching the man in the back of the knees. The man fell in surprise, and Ethnar stepped on his ribs as he pressed forward. He gave a glancing blow to the side of a third man before moving on to the next boulder. He'd fled with 2 men completely untouched, which left a bad taste in his mouth, but he couldn't win a drawn-out fight against numbers like that. Still, he didn't know what else to do. He needed to be mobile enough so that if Lord Debin entered the fight, he'd notice in time and get the man to follow him. His entire plan revolved around that. If they launched the Pyrotar into the fort before then, it wouldn't matter. He dashed behind another stone and then another before he found a second squad. These soldiers must have put their focus entirely on watching the slave revolters, because none of them turned as he approached. He moved into the group, swift and silent. 2 of them hit the ground before the rest registered what was happening. Ethnar smashed the crossbow of the 3rd man into pieces and kicked a 4th soldier hard in the tenders before escaping away. A quick glance back showed a mess of men moaning, holding their heads and other things. He whipped himself around another rock and into a 3rd squad. These men fought together and Ethnar only disabled 1 before retreating. As he did so, a large shadow swooped down at him. He ducked, swinging his rod, narrowly missing Mick's Alform. The bird pulled up and turned around for another pass. "You don't have to do this," Ethnar yelled to him. "This isn't your cause, your fight." The owl screeched at him, baring its claws as it dove. Ethnar swung, forcing the Alform to veer off course. The men from the 3rd squad caught up to him and moved to surround him. Ethnar spent all his time parrying their swords, with no time for offensive strikes of his own. A crossbow bolt whizzed from the direction of the rebels, striking 1 soldier square in the back. Ethnar pounced on the moment, moving into the open gap and bashing the head of the soldier who moved to stop him. Ethnar dashed off, the remaining soldiers ducking behind their boulder. Mick circled above him, likely waiting for his chance. Ethnar didn't mind the threat so much as he did the fact that it gave away his location to all the other squads he'd hoped to sneak up on. He pulled behind a boulder, catching his breath. It looked like a 4th squad waited 2 boulders down. He pushed off the stone, preparing his next charge, but stopped as a streak of fire hurled through the sky overhead and hit on the mountain just above Tassak's little fort. Flames spread, lighting the night, burning hot despite landing on stone. Drips of fire fell into the makeshift fort. "Too high, you imbeciles," Lord Debin's voice yelled out over the quarry. "Again!" His voice hadn't come from the catapult. He'd moved into the quarry. Now was Ethnar's chance. He bolted through the boulders, ignoring the squads he passed. He moved slightly away from where he'd heard Lord Debin, but mostly toward the catapult. He emerged from the quarry and found 10 soldiers guarding the catapult, along with 4 engineers and Mix. The Bestowed architect stood behind the catapult, face pale as he watched the other engineers at work. Was he really going to just stand by as Lord Debin murdered hundreds? The engineers feverishly spread the tar over another woven ball with odd sponges attached to the end of sticks. 1 soldier drew his sword and attempted to hand off his torch to an engineer, who squealed in terror. The engineer shoved the soldier's torch back. "Not now, you idiot. Do you want to burn us all?" The 4 soldiers with torches stood awkwardly after that, as the remaining 6 rushed Ethnar. Ethnar brought down his rod into the first man's leg with a crunch. Then he ducked and dodged the others as he sprinted toward the engineers. Maybe he could break the wooden ball into pieces. He saw a few more balls behind Mix, and if he broke them all, then the catapult would be essentially useless. If the soldiers defunded the balls, then the cranking mechanism on the catapult looked fragile enough that he could dismantle it with a good blow. But he'd have to hop up on top of the catapult for that, likely trapping himself there. That wouldn't work for his plan with Lord Debin. He blocked a sword slash from a soldier holding a torch and then spun, sweeping the rod out from him in a wide arc. The surrounding men backed up a step, giving Ethnar enough space to run through and bust the pyrotar ball into pieces. He kicked over the barrel of tar for good measure and rushed toward the remaining balls. The soldiers realized his target, but they were too late. Ethnar had 1 step on them. Mick's Alform dove for him. Ethnar swung upward, striking the bird's wing. It tumbled to the ground. The distraction had cost him, though. Several soldiers beat him to the woven balls, and the others came up close behind. He needed to make sure. The right side of his body went limp and weak. To his right, Mix and several soldiers collapsed entirely. Trying not to panic, Ethnar rolled to his left, the strength in his right side returning as he hit the ground and pulled himself up. He was just on the edge of Lord Debin's range. On the slave ship, Ethnar had seen Lord Debin selectively target slaves while leaving his own men with strength. But he must have needed a visual or something, because he'd affected the soldiers this time. Regrettably, Ethnar turned away from the woven balls to his right, and ran off into the darkness to his left, and hopefully out of Lord Debin's range. He ran uphill, trying to create enough distance for himself. He didn't know if dimension or plane affected Lord Debin's ability. Did it spread out like a wave? Or did it affect the area all around him vertically as well? If it did, Ethnar might not be creating much distance running uphill. He glanced back and saw as Lord Debin emerged from among the quarry stones. "Slather up another round," he shouted. "They're right where we want them." Ethnar reached the top of the hill and looked down. The engineers scrambled to obey Debin's order. Debin himself looked up at Ethnar with what had to be fury, though Ethnar couldn't make out much in the flickering torchlight. "Come on, follow." Debin didn't budge. Ethnar stooped down, hands raking the ground beneath him. He grasped a good-sized stone and launched it. It went far enough, thanks to his high ground, and struck an engineer. The man howled. Ethnar bent over to grab another stone, but abandoned the idea as Lord Debin took off toward him. Ethnar's first instinct was to flee, but he couldn't just let them load that catapult again. Tassak's men depended on him, rather than taking off back toward his trap. Ethnar ran to the side. "Mix," he called, "this is not who you are. You are a manifest, bestowed by nature itself. Will you cower forever?" Mix stood, glancing at the men around him as if embarrassed by having been called out. Ethnar understood. He didn't know how Mix had gotten here, what he'd lost or what had been taken from him. But Ethnar knew loss. He knew the fear of futility. He knew the hopelessness that Mix wrestled with. It was because of that knowledge that Ethnar swelled with pride as Mix suddenly lashed out at the man next to him, pulling his torch away from him and throwing it into the puddle of tar oozing on the ground. The flames rose instantly, catching the catapult and several men in their grasp. Mix scooped up his hull-form and took off at a run, but collapsed a few steps later. Halfway up the hill, Lord Debin had turned back and growled down at the burning catapult. Ethnar grabbed another stone and threw, striking Lord Debin on the shoulder. "Don't think this is over, Mix," Lord Debin called over his shoulder as he ran after Ethnar. "It's a shame your daughter will have to pay for your mistakes." Mix pushed himself to his feet, but that's all Ethnar had time to see. Lord Debin sprinted toward him, black pearl dangling from his neck. Ethnar turned and dashed into the night, the most powerful man he'd ever encountered close behind. He'd saved Tassak's men, for now. The rest depended on his next step working. It was time to kill or be killed. Chapter 12. As Ethnar approached the yards, crews of slaves worked by lantern light to repair the damage he'd done to the Indomitable support structure. A handful of taskmasters directed the slaves to attach ropes to the ship and tie them to the support pillars, while some others had organized larger groups to hold ropes and keep things in place until they tied them down. Most of the slaves just fretted around, aimless without Mix's direction. A crew of 4 men held the rope he'd left dangling purposefully. It led up towards the mainmast, which leaned at an awkward angle. Perfect. He sprinted to 2 ropes tied to the stone weight anchors. His shoulders relaxed just a hair as the saw he'd left behind the weights came into view. He'd worried some slave would take it for some task or another. He snatched up the tool, frantically sawing at the ropes. The first one snapped, increasing the tension in the second. The men holding the rope he'd left untied groaned as more weight pulled on them. They yelled at him in concern. "This rope's attached to the mainmast," one of them shouted. "If it falls, it could destroy the ship." More slaves rushed to help. One slave tried to stop Ethnar as he sawed at the next rope, but Ethnar kicked him squarely in the chest while still sawing. The man fell, then wisely scrambled away. Lord Debin entered the yard, stopping a moment and glancing around frantically. Ethnar had done a good job of cutting almost every support rope to the Indomitable. The ship had slipped back on its track several feet, support scaffolding fallen over, and the secondary mast in the front had toppled off the ship entirely. The remaining rope snapped as he cut through the fibers, pain searing his cheek as it whipped across his face. but he had no time to wallow in pain. He jumped onto the ship's ladder and climbed for his life, satisfied as the men holding the last rope heaved in exertion. His heart beat so fast that it felt more like a constant quiver. He just needed to make it to the top. If Lord Deben caught him on the ladder, he'd fall to a rather meaningless death. The rope ladder seemed to sprout more rungs as he climbed, his arms and legs shaking from the prior combat and mad sprint to get here. He longed to know how close Lord Deben was, but he couldn't afford to look back. What if he wasn't fast enough? Even meticulously conditioned bodies gave out at some point. His fingers curled around the ship's railing. Halfway over, his muscles seized, strength evaporating as Lord Deben's power hit him, and he slapped down onto the deck face first. He tried to suck down the air his lungs so desperately needed, but only found the strength for short, shuddering gasps. Honestly, it only felt a little different than where his body already was. He'd pushed himself to the brink, and maybe then some. Despite all that, he needed to push even further to get into position. He pulled his arm out from under him and gripped the deck beneath him with the flat of his palm, pulling himself forward with a groan. He willed his other arm to do the same, moving forward a bit more. He howled in frustration. He was so close, and yet he might not make it. Lord Deben would be halfway up the ladder at this point. Thankfully, the Crag Mason had wanted a big ship, and that meant long rope ladders. Ethnar crawled along, avoiding the pitch he'd spread over most of the deck. This left him a small path to follow, and hopefully Lord Deben would do the same. "It is you, Nyalaran," Lord Deben's voice said from behind him. "I couldn't quite tell in the quarry." Ethnar kept crawling. He could see the notch he'd made in the wood just ahead of him. He heard Lord Deben's feet hit the deck. "The Watani tribe leader told me you would be trouble," he said. "He asked me to keep you alive." Ethnar glanced back. Lord Deben strode up behind him, smiling. "But he's not here, is he?" The Crag Mason grabbed Ethnar's arm and yanked him around onto his back. Ethnar scooted backwards, wood splinters digging into his skin. He was almost there. "You killed his son for shame. He wanted you to live every day knowing you'd lost everything, just as you'd taken everything from him." Lord Deben laughed. "The request was so dark. I loved it. Too bad you've become too much a problem to make that vision come true." He kicked Ethnar, who used the force of the blow to roll himself just a little further. "The fire was my idea," Lord Deben said, looming over him. "Really makes them scream." "Do you hear screams, Nyalaran?" Ethnar ignored the comment. He was almost there. Lord Deben grabbed him under the armpits and pulled him up until they were face to face. "Answer me when I'm talking to you. Do you hear their screams?" Ethnar hadn't made it to his spot. He had to just hope they were close enough. He didn't want to, but if he went down with Lord Deben, it would be well worth it. "Every day, every hour they are with me," Ethnar said, an involuntary cry wrenching itself from his throat as he said the words. Lord Deben's face split wide in a maniacal grin. Nature above, this man was a monster. And Ethnar had to end him. His eyes flicked down to the boards beneath Lord Deben's feet. Then he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted with as much strength as he had left. "Paul!" Chapter 13. Lord Deben looked down in fear. The black pearl around his neck flashed almost immediately, and every person around the Indomitable collapsed, including the crew holding up the rope that led up to the mast. A cord snapped above them, and Ethnar pushed off with everything he had left. While the rope had led up to the mast, he'd connected it to a set of pulleys holding up one of the weight anchors. The mass of stone fell, crashing onto Lord Deben's back. It crushed him into the deck, which cracked and bent inward, but didn't fully break. Blinding white filled Ethnar's vision, and he screamed in agony as his leg snapped, caught between Lord Deben and the crumbling deck. What little strength he had returned, but it didn't seem to matter as pain shot through his body. He heaved in and out with cries of anguish, his own prayer for nature to end his suffering, that of his leg and his heart. It seemed like hours before he gained control of his breathing. He tried to assure himself with the thought that he'd broken a leg in the arena before, but he'd had a luminant to heal it for him then. Here, with no help, the wound would likely kill him. He looked down at Lord Deben's body. At least Ethnar would die for something. Lord Deben stirred, his head lifting off of Ethnar's stomach. Ethnar tried to move but couldn't even budge. The pain from the effort shot from his leg and surged through his whole body. Ethnar looked around him for something, anything. Lord Debin groaned. Who betrayed me? Ethnar shook his head. No one. Your blast took out your own men who were holding this stone up. The crag mason coughed, blood leaking from his mouth. The stone sat on the middle of his back, covering his legs and pinning down one arm. Ethnar waited for the other arm to choke him, punch him, some sort of attack. It hung motionless from Lord Debin's shoulder. Lord Debin's eyes widened as he came to the realization a moment before Ethnar did. The blow had paralyzed him. Ethnar reached out and broke the chain around Lord Debin's neck. He looked at the pearl for a second. Maybe we'll let you live, Ethnar said, knowing every day that you've lost everything. He chucked the necklace overboard as Debin let out a whimper in protest. A slave clambered over the railing from the rope ladder. Lord Debin! Before Lord Debin could react, Ethnar pulled the man's face into his stomach. He couldn't know the intentions of the slave. Your master is dead, Ethnar said, and you're free. The slave stepped closer, eyeing them in disbelief. He took in the stone, the lifeless arm on the deck, and Ethnar cradling Lord Debin's head in his stomach. Paralyzed, the crag mason couldn't move, couldn't struggle. Ethnar's hold on him incapacitated what little mobility Lord Debin had in his neck. Did you not hear me? Spread the news, you're free. With wide eyes the slave stared, and Ethnar grew impatient with the effort of holding Debin still. What was the slave waiting for? Ethnar might die of pain before this man ever moved. After what felt like an eternity, the slave stumbled backward. Master Debin is dead, he shouted, heading down the ladder. Master Debin is dead. Ethnar couldn't tell the emotion of the shout. Was the slave terrified or rejoicing? Either way, the yards turned into mass chaos as the slaves shouted and pushed past each other, hurrying to get to anywhere but there. Another cry rose up in the tangled mess of shouting men. Derosk's armies have reached the eastern gates. Ethnar looked down to see Lord Debin's reaction to the news, releasing his grip. Lord Debin remained motionless. Ethnar lifted the crag mason's head up, putting his hand under the man's nose and mouth. He wasn't breathing. Ethnar had suffocated him. Ethnar waited, half expecting Lord Debin to wake up, shrug the stone off his back and kill him. The crag mason didn't so much as twitch. Of course he didn't. As powerful as he was, he didn't have invulnerability or phenomenal strength. Still, Ethnar found it hard to believe that his plan had worked. Lord Debin was gone. Ethnar let out a quivering breath of relief and collapsed back onto the deck of the ship and closed his eyes. He listened to the cacophony of frantic scramble that surrounded him, noticing that the noises sounded far louder than the distant screams in his mind. They would always be there, but for the first time he realized they would quiet. He could never undo what Lord Debin had done, but he had done something about it. No one would suffer under that evil man again. He ran his hand along the wood of the ship's deck beneath him. His father would approve of its quality, sturdy, no knots. What would have happened here had he stayed an apprentice to his father all those years ago? What would have happened to Tarsak or the invading army? He would never know. Eventually, the surrounding shipyard went quiet, and he heard the faint whisper of the ocean waves coming in and flowing out almost in tandem with his pain and consciousness. All the exhaustion, all the stress caught up to Ethnar as he lay there. His body sagged, and he struggled to keep his eyes open. He fought it for only a moment before accepting the relief. Chapter 14. The rope ladder creaked and Ethnar snapped his eyes open. He hurt, but what else was new? Blessedly, he'd gone numb from the waist down, so the pain could have been much worse. Lord Debin's corpse lay on top of him, stiff and cold. To the side he saw the light of early morning streaming onto the ship's deck. A shadow passed over the light, and an owl landed next to him. A moment later, Mix's voice cried out from below. He's up on deck. Mix's human form appeared over the railing a moment later, and he ran over to Ethnar. Tarsak followed not too far behind. When Mix reached Ethnar, he pulled a measurement cord out of his apron pocket and put it up against the weight anchor, muttering to himself about how in tarnation they'd get it off. His owl form flew off somewhere else. Tussac bent low, looking Ethnar up and down. I bet you'd like a mud pit right about now. Ethnar cracked a weak smile. The Paladins came, Tussac said. The guild could not defend the city. A crag mason who controlled wind made their archers useless. The guild surrendered almost immediately after they heard of Lord Debin's death. Darask's men are organizing boats for return home. We did it, champion. We did it. His voice cracked as he spoke the last words. Ethnar reached up and with a grimace patted his friend on the arm, then nodded down to Lord Debin on his stomach. I guess your metaphor about the wildebeest was true then. No, Tussac shook his head. I had it completely wrong. He knelt, touching his forehead to Ethnar's. One lion changed the entire course of the herd. The Fadana forever in your debt. This time Ethnar smiled fully. Clever kid. I am the only one lion right now. Tussac scrunched his brow in confusion. Maybe a pun in Valorian was too much for him. This lion sure needed some heavy prodding, Ethnar said, moving on. Thanks are due to the man who kept at him with a sharp stick. Up here, Mix called as his oar landed on the railing. A portly woman popped her head up over the railing. She looked over the pitch Ethnar had spread over the deck, her gaze finishing on Ethnar still trapped under the weight anchor and a corpse. What a mess you've made here, she said, wagging her finger at him. She hopped the railing and shuffled over to Ethnar. She scanned him, then poked him a few times. She had way too many rings on her fingers. She tapped Mix on the shoulder. He had just finished fishing a long rope through the weight anchor's metal loop and up to a pulley. Mix, isn't it? Mix nodded. Well, Mix, how am I supposed to heal a patient who is still being crushed? Mix scratched at his neck. I'm working on it. The woman grabbed the rope from his hands. You just need to pull on this, right? Mix snorted. Yeah, well, you and 6 other men. The woman nodded understandingly and then tossed the rope over the side of the ship. Shemnon, Valtan, pull on this. A moment later, the weight anchor lifted and Ethnar yelled in pain as Tussac pulled him out from under the large stone. Good, shouted the woman, and the weight anchor slapped back down onto Lord Debin. Painful tingles spread throughout Ethnar's legs once Tussac settled him a few feet from the anchor, the precursor to the agony he knew to be coming. The woman knelt next to Ethnar's leg, and her hands began to glow with a warm, fleshy light. She set her hands on his leg, and he immediately noticed a trickle of power. A luminant. The Paladins had a luminant. Incredible. The woman hummed as her hands slowly moved up and down his leg. Ethnar didn't know how long it took, but he'd done this many times. He breathed deeply, imagining a little more of the pain leaving his body with each breath. Finally, the woman pulled him to his feet and Mix gave him a hearty pat on the back. Ethnar flexed his leg out in front of him. The luminant's power left him feeling refreshed and ready to take on the world again. He hadn't felt this good since before the championship match at the Festival of 5. Mix pointed to the weight anchor on the deck. How did you do it? I didn't, Ethnar said. He sapped the strength from the men holding the weight up. Mix snorted like that made the most sense in the world. Ethnar gave one last look over at Lord Debin. The second drop of the stone hadn't done him any favors. This man had conquered, broken so many, and yet it was Ethnar who stood today on top of the Indomitable. He walked over to the edge of the ship, looking down over the railing. A massive stag stood below, with 2 men untying the weight anchor rope from around its belly. The first man looked every part the warrior as muscled as Ethnar himself, but taller. Leather armor covered his chest and legs. The other man looked a little thin, his short dark beard showing hints of grey. Valtan, catch me. The luminant woman leapt from the railing beside him. Ethnar reached out to grab her, but he reacted too slowly. A huge gust of wind roared into the shipyard, surging upward toward the woman. It pushed against her, and she fell as if attached to a cord before landing softly on her feet. Ethnar blinked the dust out of his eyes. Had he misseen? He'd heard of the Paladins of Valoria Bestowed gathered under the cause of King Darask, but he'd never imagined this. The bearded man rushed over to the woman. You've got to stop doing that. It scares the living daylights out of me. The portly woman smiled at him. Like that time you were too slow? Yeah, that time, the man shook his head. I never want to see your leg bend that way again. All right, I'll hold off for a while. The bearded man rolled his eyes, and the muscled warrior stepped forward, looking up at Ethnar. Are you the Nialaran champion? Ethnar rolled his shoulders back. I am. Ethnar watched as the sun dipped behind the ocean. He stood on a balcony in the tallest building in Alpheus, the former guild hall. The muscled warrior Shemnon stood beside him with hands clasped behind his back. They had been engrossed in terms of surrender, property allocation, and voyage preparation all day. Shemnon had administrated as best he could. He had insisted that Ethnar act as his interpreter despite more qualified individuals being available. Ethnar had never realized how much bureaucracy went into taking over a city. You did well today. Ethnar looked over to Shemnon, surprised. Shemnon had done all the work. I just interpreted as best I could. Shemnon shook his head. No, it was more than that. You treated others with sincerity, took their word as best you could, and deftly accommodated different cultural needs. It was the last ingredient I needed to see. Ingredient. Maybe Ethnar's day of interpreting had messed with his understanding of language. What did you need to see that for? Ethnar asked. Shemnon removed the necklace around his neck, a simple leather band with a pendant of several colored ribbons. In the center sat a round diamond. He handed it to Ethnar. Being a paladin is much more than just prowess in battle. We're trying to build something, a kingdom if we can. People need to know they can rely upon a paladin, that they will make the best decision they can for everyone. I wanted to be sure, before I offered you a position as one. He nodded to the necklace. Ethnar felt his heartbeat pick up. This man had met him just this morning, and here he was, offering him a position among the most powerful warriors in the country. There had to be some mistake. But you are all bestowed, Ethnar said slowly. I am just a clansman. Shemnon had been gifted a regal stag form from nature. Ethnar wove baskets and clobbered a head or two. Shemnon laughed. Darisk wants the best. After what I heard about you today, you fit the bill. The Fadan clansmen said you accounted for 16 takedowns. I interviewed some of the captive guild soldiers. One called you a spectre of nature's judgment. While Ethnar appreciated the praise of his efforts, he hung his head. Shemnon knew about his deeds today, but he was clueless about who Ethnar had been the last few weeks. He held the necklace out for Shemnon to take. I almost didn't act at all last night. I nearly gave up on defending my people or fighting back. I didn't want to cause any more harm. You don't want a coward in your paladins. Shemnon closed Ethnar's fingers around the pendant of the necklace. I don't care what you almost did. Look at what you actually did. He pointed to the docks, where hundreds of Fadans still loaded a ship with supplies for the journey north. Ethnar had seen the slaves loading and unloading cargo since his arrival, but now they did it with their shoulders back, almost a bounce to their step. He couldn't blame them, but he hadn't done that. You, Shemnon, are the liberator of this city. That would have happened without me. Shemnon sighed. You're not the one walking the streets right now with a stag form and hearing what people are saying with his incredible stag hearing. They're not calling me the liberator. We prepared for this siege for 3 months. Last night's attack was supposed to be a testing of the fortifications, and it ended in their all-out surrender. We may have liberated these people eventually, but the cost would have been astronomically greater. Ethnar nodded. Denying the truth just because it elevated oneself would be foolish. Shemnon spoke clear logic. A battle against Lord Debin would have changed things immensely. He gripped the necklace in his hand. How do you know I'm not returning north to my clan? Shemnon looked at him for a long moment, a sad look in his eye. We've been around clansmen setting plans to depart all day. You haven't said a word to anyone about joining them. Yet you look at them with a sad longingness. I think you've resigned yourself to stay here. The words hurt to hear out loud, but Shemnon had pegged him precisely. He couldn't go back. There was nothing to go back to except for painful memories. He didn't want to feed the screams any more than he had to. He'd finally taken his first step in quieting them. Shemnon glanced down at Ethnar's hand clasped around the necklace. So? One last question, Ethnar said. How do you know I would even want to be a paladin? I have only heard little of you until now. Why would I live a life of constant war? I'm sure you have Valorians who dream about joining you, and here you give a spot to a foreigner. Oh, you want to join us, mate? Shemnon said, a sly grin playing on his lips. You're a protector. That's what we do. We are the Knights of the Lost Cause. Considering what you did here, I don't think you'll find a better clan for you. His use of the word clan struck Ethnar. It might have offended other clansmen, but not Ethnar. At least not today. Truth was, he needed a clan now. Sure, there were other Nialaran villages, but after what he'd experienced, what he'd done, he'd always be an outsider among them. But the Paladins, though. Ethnar had risen to the task of defeating Lord Debin because he'd believed the Fadan clansmen a lost cause. Shemnon nodded to him as if he could read his thoughts. You didn't know it, but you've wanted to be a part of the Paladins your whole life. Ethnar smiled and placed the necklace over his head, letting the leather rest on the skin at the back of his neck. For a moment, his mind and soul were silent. Yes, perhaps he had. Epic New Worlds.
Thank you for listening to The Bestowed, Champion of the Condemned. For more stories of the Bestowed and Valoria, please visit author CRyanCrockett.com.